Something is keeping you awake tonight. Not noise, not worry. Exactly. More like a question that has been circling in the back of your mind for a while now. A feeling you cannot quite name. The kind that waits for you in the spaces between tasks, in the silence after the lights go out, in the particular quiet of this hour. It arrives at night, because that is when the busy world finally goes quiet enough for you to hear it. And so you are here. Let your shoulders settle. Let your breath find its own rhythm without your management. Tonight, we are going to sit with a man who understood suffering better than almost anyone who ever lived. Not because he theorized about it from a comfortable chair, but because he lived inside it, survived it, and came out the other side carrying something the rest of us are still trying to understand. His name was Fyodor Dostoevsky. And before we begin, there are two things worth knowing. The first is this. There are two kinds of suffering. One wears you down. The other carves something open in you. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid both. Dostoevsky spent his life learning to tell them apart. The second is this. Somewhere in his story there is a moment, a cold square, a winter morning, a row of rifles pointed directly at him that changed everything he believed about what it means to be alive. We will get to that story. But first, we need to understand what brought him there, because the wound that eventually deepened him was not a single event. It was an entire life. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821, the second of 7 children. His father was a military doctor, devout, strict, and frequently frightening. His mother was warm and quietly literary. She read to the children. She showed them, by example, that words could carry a person through places that ordinary life could not reach. She died of tuberculosis when Fyodor was 15. 2 years later, his father was killed. Violently, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some said it was the serfs on his estate. Some said it was a local dispute. The truth was swallowed by silence, as truths often are. But Dostoevsky never forgot what sudden loss felt like. He never forgot what violence felt like. He carried both of them into every character he ever created. Let the weight of your body settle where it rests. There is nowhere you need to be. By his late 20s, he had published his first novel and been welcomed into St. Petersburg Literary Society. He was a young man with a gift that everyone could see. He had everything a young writer could want: talent, recognition, and a future that seemed to open ahead of him. And then everything fell apart. Not all at once, slowly, the way it often does. He had joined a circle of idealistic young men who met secretly to discuss banned political ideas. They passed around forbidden books. They argued about freedom and equality and what a more just Russia might look like. They were young and earnest and not nearly careful enough. The authorities arrested them in 1849. The sentence was death. Dostoevsky was 27 years old. Here is the thing about suffering that he would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate. The wound does not always break you. Sometimes, when it arrives at the right moment and is survived with the right kind of attention, it does something else entirely. It opens you. Like a door that has been shut for too long, suddenly coming free. He wrote in a letter to his brother from prison that he had begun to see human nature more clearly from inside suffering than he ever had from the outside. That hardship had given him a second sight, an ability to feel his way into another person's interior world that he had not possessed before, to understand not just what a person did, but why. Not just what they showed, but what they were hiding, and what they were hiding it from. Most of us know suffering only as something to escape. Dostoevsky knew it as something to enter. Not because he was drawn to pain for its own sake, not because he believed suffering was secretly good, but because he had seen with great clarity what happened to people who refused to feel it. They grew hollow, they grew brittle, they performed their lives rather than living them. And he could not write that. He could only write what he had survived. There is a quieter layer beneath all of this. The wound that deepens is not the wound that destroys you. It is the wound you eventually turn toward instead of away from. It is the wound that forces you to ask a harder question than any you were asking before. Tonight, we are going to follow that wound through the life and work of one of the most extraordinary minds who ever put pen to paper. We will not arrive at easy comfort, but we may arrive at something more useful, a map of the soul. And sometimes, when you have been handed the right map at the right moment, you discover that you are not as lost as you thought. By the time we reach the end of this, something may feel different, not fixed, not resolved, but a little more witnessed. And sometimes that is exactly enough to let you rest. Chapter 2, Suffering and the Split Soul. The first thing Dostoevsky noticed about people, and he noticed it in himself before anyone else, was that the human being is not one thing. We are at least two things, always. There is the version of us that functions in the world, the one that makes decisions, shows up, keeps promises, manages impressions, and maintains the story we tell others about who we are. And then there is the other one, the one that lies awake at night, the one that knows things the public version would never admit, the one that watches the performance from slightly to the side and is not entirely convinced. Dostoevsky called this the split soul. Not in those exact words, but the idea runs through everything he ever wrote like a current through dark water. His characters are almost never simple. They do not want one thing. They want two things that cancel each other out. They love and destroy the same person. They seek punishment and resist it. They confess and then immediately deny. They believe in something and curse it in the same paragraph. This is not a flaw in his writing. It is the most honest thing he ever did, because that is what the soul actually looks like from the inside. Let your breath settle. Let the muscles along your shoulders release a little. Think about a time you knew what the right thing to do was and did not do it anyway. Not because you were weak exactly, but because something in you pulled in a different direction with a force that logic could not explain, something older than reason, something that had its own reasons. Dostoevsky would have recognized you immediately. He spent his entire career writing about this gap between what we know and what we do, between who we believe ourselves to be and what we find ourselves capable of in the moments that matter. And his great insight, the one that took him decades to arrive at, was this: the split is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to be understood, because what the split is actually describing is the full range of being human, the capacity for cruelty and tenderness at the same time, the mind that can reason clearly and still betray itself, the heart that can love deeply and still choose badly. He had experienced both extremes in himself. He had known what it was to be respected and to be a prisoner, to be wealthy and to be destitute, to be genuinely loved and to feel utterly alone in a room full of people. The extremes of his own life gave him a fluency in the full range of human experience that few writers have ever matched. Here is the small detail that changes everything. He did not write about the split to condemn it. He wrote about it to illuminate it, and that is a completely different project. Most moral writing in his era was about calling people to be better, about identifying the error, the weakness, the sin, and demanding correction. There was an audience for that, and there still is. Dostoevsky was more interested in something prior to correction. He wanted to know, how does a person arrive at the place where they do the thing they cannot explain? What is happening inside the soul in the hours and days before the catastrophe? What does the interior world look like when no one else is watching and the performance has temporarily stopped? This is why his novels feel so strange and so right at the same time. They are not moral fables with clean lessons. They are psychological excavations. And what he keeps finding when he digs deep enough is not darkness at the bottom, it is longing. Every twisted character in his fiction, every murderer and liar and self-destructor and compulsive gambler is ultimately longing for something pure, for love without conditions, for acceptance without performance, for a single moment of complete honesty that does not end in humiliation. The person who harms others is almost always the person who was most deeply harmed. The person who pushes love away is often the person who needs it most specifically. The person who performs indifference is almost certainly the person most devastated by being unseen. This does not excuse anything. It explains everything. And explanation, for Dostoevsky, was not a way of letting people off the hook. It was a way of treating them as full human beings rather than problems to be categorized and managed. He had been treated as a problem, as a prisoner, as a number in a ledger. He knew what it felt like to be reduced, and he wrote against it with everything he had for the rest of his life. The soul is not simple. It is not consistent. It does not behave the way we would prefer, but at its deepest layer, it is in search of something real. And that search, that persistent, difficult, often misdirected search for contact with what is genuinely alive, is what we are going to follow tonight. Chapter 3. The Underground Mind Notes from Underground, published in 1864, is one of the strangest books ever written. It is narrated by a man who has no name. He calls himself simply the Underground Man. He is 40 years old, retired from a minor government position in St. Pons, Petersburg, living alone in a small apartment and deeply, obsessively aware of everything that is wrong with himself and with the world. He is not likable. He would be the first to tell you that. He is petty, resentful, sarcastic, and self-defeating. He performs contempt for human connection while craving it desperately. He knows every flaw in his own character and narrates them with a precision that is almost surgical. He is also, in the course of his long and wandering monologue, one of the most psychologically accurate portrayals of a certain kind of mind that has ever been put into words. You may recognize something in him, not the pettiness necessarily, not the spite, but the awareness, the feeling of watching yourself from slightly outside, the experience of knowing too much about your own motivations to act simply. The paralysis that comes from seeing every angle of a problem so clearly that none of them feels completely right. Dostoevsky called this hyper-consciousness, and he understood it from the inside. Let your jaw soften. Let the next breath be easy. There is nothing to figure out right now. The Underground Man is a man who thinks too much. Not in the casual sense, we all know people who overthink, but in a more profound sense. He is a man whose intelligence has become an obstacle to his own life. He cannot act without immediately analyzing why he is acting. He cannot feel without questioning whether the feeling is authentic. He cannot want anything simply because the moment desire appears, he dissects it into its reasons, and the reasons hollow it out. The contemporary world has made more underground people than Dostoevsky could have imagined. We live in an era that rewards self-awareness and punishes naivety. We are taught to question everything, including our own instinct. And for many people, this education in irony and skepticism has left them unable to trust anything fully, not other people, not themselves, not the simple emotional responses that human beings were built to have. The Underground Man is not wrong about most of the things he observes. He is perceptive, precise, often painfully accurate about human self-deception. But being right, Dostoevsky understood, is not the same as being alive. Something changes when you look closer at his condition, because the underground man's real problem is not his intelligence, it is his refusal to be vulnerable. Every sharp observation is also a defense. Every piercing insight is also a wall. He sees through people so that he cannot be hurt by them. He mocks connection so that he cannot be refused it. He is, underneath all that corrosive self-awareness, a person who is desperately lonely. What makes him so devastating and so useful as a character is that he knows this. He knows he is his own worst enemy. He can describe the pattern with clinical precision. He understands the mechanism that is running him, and still he cannot stop. This is the underground man's tragedy and his gift to the reader. Because when you see his trap clearly enough, you begin to see versions of it closer to home. Not the same trap, your version will look different. But the mechanism is recognizable. The way intelligence, when it is not accompanied by the courage to feel, can become a kind of prison. The way self-knowledge, without self-compassion, loops back on itself and produces only more analysis. The mind that watches itself too carefully begins to freeze. Dostoevsky wrote this more than a century before anyone had mapped the relationship between rumination and depression, between self-monitoring and paralysis, between the hypervigilant mind and its own exhaustion. He just knew. From the inside. And the underground, he was suggesting, is not a place. It is a posture. The posture of the mind that has withdrawn from the world but cannot stop reacting to it. The person who says they do not care, who proves over and over again that they do. And the way out, the route Dostoevsky would spend the rest of his career tracing, is not more thinking. It is something else entirely. We will get there. But first, we need to go a little further into the dark. Chapter 4. Overthinking in the dark. There is a specific kind of sleeplessness that has nothing to do with noise or discomfort. The body is fine. The room is fine. The world outside has gone quiet. But something is running inside the mind. A loop. A problem approached from every angle that still will not resolve. A conversation replayed with slightly different editing each time. A decision rehearsed. A question that keeps returning, wearing a different disguise, but asking the same thing it has always been asking. You know this feeling. Dostoevsky knew it too. The underground man's long interior monologue is not just literature. It is a map of what happens when the mind turns against itself. And what Dostoevsky understood almost 2 centuries ago is that this kind of mental weather is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of sensitivity that has not yet found its container. Let the next breath be slightly slower, just a little. That is all. Here is what is happening when the mind will not stop at night. At its core, the mind is a pattern recognition machine. Its job is to make sense of things. When something does not resolve, when a problem has no clear solution, when a feeling has no clear name, when a relationship has no clear conclusion, the mind keeps returning to it. Not because it is malfunctioning, because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is trying to finish what has not been finished. The trouble is that some things cannot be finished by thinking. Some things can only be finished by feeling, or by time, or by the slow acceptance that certain questions simply do not have answers that fit inside the kind of logic the mind prefers to work with. Dostoevsky understood this intuitively. His characters overthink in ways that destroy them, not because thinking is bad, but because they are using thinking to avoid something that only feeling can reach. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, does not commit his crime in a moment of passion. He thinks his way into it, rationally, methodically. He constructs an argument that justifies the unjustifiable, and then, when the argument is airtight and complete, he acts on it and immediately knows it was wrong. Not because the argument failed, but because the argument was never really the point. The real question underneath the argument was one he could not think his way around. Think of someone you know, or perhaps think of yourself, who cannot stop replaying a particular situation, who has examined it from every angle, who has written it out, talked it through, and still returns to it at 2 inches the morning with the engine still running. The problem is not insufficient analysis. The problem is that the mind is treating a wound as though it were a math problem, and wounds do not respond to math. They respond to acknowledgement, to being witnessed, to the slow, patient process of being felt rather than solved. Dostoevsky's most self-destructive characters are the ones who refuse this. They are brilliant, often. They can identify every error in their own thinking with impressive precision. But they will not put down the analysis long enough to simply feel what is there, and the feeling, postponed indefinitely, does not disappear. It accumulates. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The surface beneath you is doing the work. You can let it. The thing Dostoevsky kept finding across novel after novel is that the mind quiets not when it finishes thinking, but when it is given something real to rest against. Something that is not analysis. Something that is contact. Contact with another person, honestly present. Contact with a truth that has been avoided. Contact with a feeling that has been repeatedly postponed. The underground man's tragedy is that he will not make contact with anything real. He observes, critiques, and retreats. The loop continues. But for Dostoevsky himself, contact was eventually what changed him. The brutal, unexpected contact of standing before a firing squad. The long, slow contact of prison life with other human beings who were suffering just as much as he was, in ways he could not dismiss or theorize around. He did not think his way through, he lived his way through. And if you are lying awake tonight with the engine of your own mind still running, that may be worth sitting with gently. You do not need to solve anything before morning, you just need to be here. Chapter 5. Guilt before the crime. In Crime and Punishment, there is something Dostoevsky does that most readers on first encounter do not quite catch. Raskolnikov feels guilty before he does anything wrong. The guilt arrives first, then the crime. This is not a structural accident. It is the entire point. Dostoevsky had spent enough time inside his own psychology to understand that guilt is not always a response to something you have done. Sometimes it is a condition you carry, a feeling of fundamental wrongness that was already present and simply attaches itself to events rather than being caused by them. The underground man has it. So does Dmitry Karamazov. So does almost every major character Dostoevsky ever created. They feel guilty before the verdict, before the act, sometimes before the thought has even fully formed. Let your breath be easy. You do not need to account for anything right now. Just listen. If you have ever woken in the early hours of the morning with a vague but powerful sense that you have done something wrong, even when you cannot name what it is, you have touched what Dostoevsky was describing. It is not exactly guilt in the ordinary sense. It is something older, something more basic. It is the feeling of being fundamentally exposed, of occupying space in the world without quite enough justification, of existing in a way that might at any moment be found insufficient. Psychologists would come to call this shame rather than guilt. Not the shame of a specific wrong action, but the shame of simply being imperfect, of being limited, of being human in a world that seems to require something beyond being human. Dostoevsky did not have that vocabulary, but he lived it and wrote it with extraordinary precision. Raskolnikov constructs his theory of the extraordinary man, the idea that certain exceptional people stand above ordinary moral law, not because he actually believes himself to be extraordinary. He constructs it because he cannot bear to believe himself ordinary. That is where the wound lives. The grandiose posture is almost always, underneath it, a defense against a much smaller and more personal fear. He is not trying to be Napoleon. He is trying to escape the feeling that he is nobody, that he is one of the ordinary ones for whom nothing matters and nothing will be remembered. And that feeling has nothing to do with what he has or has not accomplished. It is a feeling about who he is, and feelings about who you are cannot be resolved by actions. You cannot achieve your way past it. You cannot impress your way out of it. You can only eventually turn toward it. Here is the small detail that changes everything. Confession, for Dostoevsky, is always about this exact turning. Not the legal act of confession, though that appears in his fiction as well, the inner one. The moment when a person stops building arguments for their own innocence and simply says, "I am here. I am this. I am not less than human for what I have felt or done or been." Raskolnikov's long, agonizing journey toward that moment takes the entire length of the novel. Dostoevsky understood it so intimately because he had traveled a version of that road himself. He had sat in a Siberian prison for 4 years, alongside men who were, by any conventional measure, criminals, murderers, thieves, men who had committed acts that society had declared unforgivable. And what he found there shook him to his foundation. These men were not monsters. They were not a different species. They were people who had been broken in ways that had not been witnessed, who had arrived at their actions through roads that, when honestly traced, reveal something universal. The guilt they carried was real, but beneath it was something that had never been allowed to speak. And Dostoevsky, sitting in the cold alongside them, began to understand that this unspoken thing, this buried, inarticulate longing for acknowledgement, was not peculiar to criminals or to Russians or to the 19th century. It was the human interior, his interior, everyone's interior, carried in different amounts, shaped by different histories, but structurally the same. The guilt before the crime is the inheritance many of us carry from moments in our lives when we learned somehow, without anyone saying it directly, that our existence required constant justification, that love was conditional, that the right to be here was something that had to be earned daily, carefully, without too much visible need. And the first step through it, which Dostoevsky charts with great care across all his major works, is simply being willing to see it for what it is. Not a truth about your worth. A story about an old wound. Chapter 6. The inner critic punishes Raskolnikov, does not confess for a very long time. Not because he lacks conscience, but because his conscience, rather than guiding him toward truth, turns against him. It becomes his persecutor. He spends the entire middle section of the novel being punished by his own mind before he is punished by any law. Fevers, paranoid episodes, conversations that go wrong in ways he cannot control. The constant sensation that the world can see what he has done, that every neutral face on the street is already judging him. This is what Dostoevsky called the punishment that precedes the sentence. And it is the inner critic's most precise and familiar form. The inner critic is not a new idea. Every tradition that has ever tried to understand the human mind has had a name for it. The harsh, internal voice. The judge who never rests. The presence that turns every difficulty into further evidence of fundamental failure. In Dostoevsky's Russia, it was often framed in terms of conscience and sin. But whether you frame it in religious language or psychological language, the mechanism is the same. Let your shoulders settle. Let the muscles behind your eyes relax. There is nothing requiring your vigilance right now. The inner critic takes something real, a mistake, a failure, a shortcoming, and extrapolates from that specific thing to a general verdict. It does not say, "You did something wrong." It says, "You are something wrong." That is the sleight of hand that causes all the damage. Because a wrong action can be corrected. It can be apologized for, learned from, made right in whatever way remains available. But being fundamentally wrong, being a flawed thing at the core, has no corrective. There is nowhere to go with that verdict except inward. Into more self-examination, more accusations, more evidence gathered against yourself by yourself. Raskolnikov is brilliant at gathering evidence. He replays the night of the crime in enormous detail. He adds what he missed. He removes every possible justification. He constructs the prosecution's case with the same skill he might have brought to any intellectual project. And because he is intelligent, because he can see clearly, the case he builds is devastating. This is the dangerous gift of the self-aware person. They are their own most effective prosecutor. The underground man has this too. A merciless internal monologue that turns every social interaction into a scene to be analyzed and found wanting. The slight he received, the way he responded to it, the way he made it worse, the way he will never live it down, the evidence this constitutes about who he is. The loop runs and runs. And here is what Dostoevsky saw that was genuinely new. His innovation was not to tell his characters to silence this voice. He did not write redemption stories in which people simply decide to feel better about themselves. He did not prescribe positive thinking or the adoption of a healthier internal dialogue. He took the inner critic seriously. He let it run its full course. He showed it everything it wanted to see. And then he watched what happened when the voice had finally said everything it had to say. What happens in his best novels is not silence. It is a kind of spiritual exhaustion, a fatigue in which the accused finally stops defending and stops attacking. And in that exhausted openness, something else can enter. Not absolution, not a verdict of innocent, something more honest than either. The recognition that the charge is partly true and partly irrelevant. That the person who did the wrong thing was suffering in ways the inner critic never bothers to account for. That they were doing, in the moment that mattered, the only thing that felt available to them, that they are not simple enough to be condemned. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The surface holds you. You do not have to hold yourself. This is what Dostoevsky kept trying to show his readers. Not that they were innocent, not that the wrongs they had committed or the failures they carried did not matter, but that they were complicated, human, And that human complication deserves something other than the contempt the inner critic reliably delivered. The inner critic, if you listen to it long enough and carefully enough, eventually reveals what it is actually afraid of. And it is never what it seems. It is not afraid that you are bad. It is afraid that you are fundamentally unlovable. That is the wound beneath the wound. And that is what we will keep circling back toward. Chapter 7, Shame and Self-Exposure. There is a scene in Notes from Underground that stays with the reader long after everything else has faded. The underground man has been peripherally invited to a farewell dinner for a man he barely knows. He arrives late. He is ignored. He spends the evening being subtly, and then not so subtly, humiliated by a group of men who have simply no reason to take him seriously. And then, rather than leaving with whatever dignity he has managed to retain, he follows the party onward and continues the performance of his own embarrassment through the rest of the evening. What makes the scene devastating is not what happens to him. It is that he sees what is happening completely, clearly, in real time, and does it anyway. That is shame. Not the hot, immediate burn of guilt over something specific. The cold, pervasive conviction that who you are at the most fundamental level is something that other people will find wanting. Dostoevsky understood shame in a way that most of his contemporaries did not have words for. Let your breath be easy. You are not here to produce anything, just to listen. Shame, unlike guilt, is not really about an action. It is about identity. Guilt says, I did a bad thing. Shame says, I am a bad thing. Guilt points at a behavior. Shame points at the self. And the underground man lives inside the second conviction so completely that it shapes every decision he makes. He anticipates rejection before it arrives. He interprets neutral behavior as contempt. He builds elaborate internal scenarios in which the people around him are secretly laughing at him, and then, because he cannot bear the distance between those scenarios and reality, he forces the confrontation. He makes the awkward moment happen. He escalates until the humiliation he feared has become the humiliation he created. This is what shame does. When it has no outlet, it starts to direct the action. The underground man's tragedy is that he cannot be seen without feeling exposed. And he cannot be exposed without it confirming the worst thing he believes about himself. So he exists in a permanent state of performed distance, holding everyone at the length where they cannot reach him, and then he hates them for not reaching him. The double bind is perfect. Now there is something here most people overlook. Dostoevsky does not write this as a case study. He writes it as a confession. The underground man is narrating his own story, and as he narrates, he is simultaneously defending himself and indicting himself. Simultaneously asking for understanding and insisting he does not want it. He is exposing himself while narrating his terror of exposure, and somehow that double motion, the flinching and the showing, the hiding and the revealing, is the most honest thing in the entire book. Because most of us live some version of this. Not the extreme version, not the underground man's total withdrawal, but something recognizable in its shape, the part of you that wants to be understood but cannot quite bear to explain, the part that needs to be seen but keeps making itself difficult to find. Self-exposure, for Dostoevsky, was not vanity or weakness. It was the only thing that broke the loop. The moment a character in his fiction actually speaks the truth, not the performed version, not the justified version, but the thing that has actually been there all along, the pressure changes. Not immediately, not cleanly, but something shifts. A crack in the surface, and air gets in. He believed this because he had experienced it himself. He had sat in that Siberian prison and been stripped of every protective layer. Social status, intellectual performance, the role of the promising young writer, the idealism of the political reformer, all of it was gone. What remained was just a man with his inner weather, sitting alongside other men with theirs. And in that bare condition, something unexpected happened. He started to feel something for those other men. Not pity, exactly. Something more equal than pity. Recognition. The recognition that the interior lives of people who looked nothing like him were, in their essential structure, very much like his own. And that recognition was the beginning of something he had not been capable of before, something that would become, in the years and decades that followed, the entire substance of his greatest work. Chapter 8, Humiliation. As Trauma Dostoevsky returned to one particular type of character again and again across his entire career, he called them sometimes the humiliated and the insulted. They are a recurring presence in his world. People who have been reduced by circumstances, by other people, by systems too large and indifferent to fight, and who carry that reduction in every gesture they make, in the way they hold themselves, in the way they flinch before they are struck. The humiliated person is not simply sad. They have been damaged in a specific place, in their understanding of what they deserve. They have been taught by events powerful enough to leave a lasting mark that they are the kind of person things happen to. That is not a thought. It is a bodily knowledge, something stored below the level of language. Let your body be heavy where it rests. You do not have to manage anything right now. In The Idiot, there is a character named Nastasia Filipovna. She is brilliant, beautiful, magnetic. She is also a woman who was exploited as a young girl by a man who had complete power over her, and who has spent the years since unable to accept that she deserves anything other than what was done to her. She is surrounded by people who want to help her. She refuses them all, not because she does not want to be helped, but because she does not believe she is the kind of person who can be. She is so accustomed to being treated as an object of someone else's story that love, when it is offered to her cleanly and without a hidden price, does not feel like love. It feels like a trick. She destroys what she loves because she believes at the deepest level that destruction is what she is. And Dostoevsky does not judge her for this. He watches her with a grief that is also unmistakably understanding, because he had seen this before. He had seen it in Siberian prisoners who could not accept small kindnesses because kindness was not part of the world they had learned to navigate. He had recognized it in himself, in the strange relief he felt when things went badly, as though the disaster had confirmed something he had been quietly bracing for. Humiliation, when it is repeated and survived, eventually becomes the baseline. It stops feeling like an injury and starts feeling like the natural condition of things. This is not weakness. This is adaptation. The nervous system, faced with consistent threat, learns to expect the threat. It becomes vigilant in the direction of pain. And when something else arrives, something gentle, something offered without a hidden cost, the vigilance does not know what to do with it. The body is not sure whether gentleness is safe. It has learned through experience that safety was not a reliable feature of the world. Notice the air around you. Notice the quiet. Your body already knows more about safety than your thoughts are giving it credit for. The insight Dostoevsky kept arriving at through his humiliated characters is that the injury was real, but the verdict was wrong. Something terrible happened. That is true. That something terrible is all that was ever going to happen. That is the injury talking, not the truth. He showed this most clearly with Alyosha Karamazov, the youngest of the three brothers. Alyosha grew up inside the same family chaos as his siblings, the same absent, drunk, shameless father, the same instability, the same conditions that produced very different outcomes in Dmitri and Ivan. And yet, Alyosha became the gentlest figure in all of Dostoevsky's fiction, not because he escaped the damage, but because he encountered someone early enough who reflected something different back to him. His teacher, the elder Zosima, showed him that the interior wound does not have to become the only lens through which the world is seen, that the person who has been reduced can, in time, choose to refuse the reduction, not by pretending it did not happen, not by minimizing what was done, but by building, slowly and imperfectly, a different self-knowledge alongside the wound. That is slow work. It does not happen in a single conversation or a single evening, but it begins with a particular quality of attention. The attention Dostoevsky tried to give his characters, not condemnation, not the inner. Critic's verdict. Something closer, much closer to mercy. Chapter 9, Freedom that Terrifies. In the brothers Karamazov, There is a passage near the middle of the novel that many readers consider the most important thing Dostoevsky ever wrote. It is called The Grand Inquisitor. Ivan Karamazov, the intellectual brother, tells a prose poem he has composed. In it, Christ returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. He moves through the streets of Seville. He heals the sick. He raises a child from the dead. People recognize him. And then, quietly, the Grand Inquisitor, an old man who has spent his entire life managing the church, has him arrested. That night, the Inquisitor visits Christ in his cell and explains why he must be imprisoned. Because freedom, the old man argues, is not what people actually want. What people want is bread, security, someone to follow, someone to tell them what to do so they do not have to bear the impossible weight of choosing for themselves. Let your breath settle. Just listen. The Inquisitor is not a simple villain. He genuinely loves the people he is keeping in gentle captivity. He believes with complete sincerity that he is being merciful, that the gift Christ offered, the gift of radical freedom, of genuine choice, of self-determination, was a gift most people could not carry. Dostoevsky was examining something he had lived in Siberia. In a prison camp, there are no choices. Everything is decided for you. When you eat, when you sleep, where you go, what you wear. And Dostoevsky noticed something uncomfortable about life inside total structure. Many prisoners, after years of it, were terrified of release. Freedom had become the thing they could not manage, because freedom means responsibility. Freedom means that when things go wrong, there is no authority to blame. Just you and the choice you made and what followed from it. Most of us, most of the time, are quietly relieved to have fewer real choices than we think we want. We complain about schedules and obligations and the narrowness of our options. But the structure also organizes our days in a way that protects us from the open, terrifying question of what we would actually do if we could do anything. The Grand Inquisitor names this with devastating precision. He says, Christ gave people freedom, but freedom is not a simple gift. It is a burden. And people have been trading it away since the beginning. For ideology, for authority, for belonging, for any system that will tell them who they are and what they should do with the hours of their lives. Dostoevsky did not entirely agree with the Inquisitor, but he understood him completely. Because the alternative, the freedom that says, you must decide, you must choose, you must live with the full weight of your own conscience, is genuinely frightening. Something changes when you look at it this way. The terrifying freedom Dostoevsky is describing is not political. It is psychological. It is the freedom to decide who you are when no one is watching, the freedom to choose your values when no one is enforcing them, the freedom to remain in a marriage, a friendship, a career, or to leave, not because society demands one thing or another, but because you have looked honestly at your own interior and done the difficult arithmetic. That kind of freedom cannot be handed to you. It can only be claimed, and claiming it requires, first, the willingness to feel how heavy it actually is. The underground man refuses this freedom. It is too exposed. He would rather spend his life being right about other people's limitations than take the risk of living his own. Raskolnikov tries to claim a twisted version of it, the freedom of the extraordinary man, exempt from ordinary moral life, and discovers that real freedom does not feel like power over others. It feels like full responsibility for yourself. Alyosha claims it quietly, without drama. And Dostoevsky seems to be saying that Alyosha's version is the rarest and the most difficult of all, because it does not require intelligence, it does not require suffering, it requires something closer to love. Love of what is real over what is comfortable. Love of the difficult truth over the story that is easier to live inside. Love of the full human being with all its contradictions, all its failure to behave as planned, over the simplified version that can be neatly managed. Chapter 10, Anxiety Before Choice. Kierkegaard, who was writing at roughly the same time, though in a different country, thinking through different but parallel questions, described anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. Dostoevsky would have recognized that phrase immediately. His characters are anxious not because they are cowardly. They are anxious because they understand at some level that what they choose next will say something permanent about who they are. Every real choice is a kind of death. Every yes closes off thousands of other possible lives. And the person who is fully awake to that, who is not numb enough to decide without feeling the weight of what is being decided, will experience that awareness as something very close to terror. Let the next breath come at its own pace. The body is doing its work without your direction. Raskolnikov's anxiety before the crime is sometimes read as simply nervousness. The nervous anticipation of someone afraid of getting caught. But Dostoevsky was writing something more precise than that. Raskolnikov is anxious because some part of him understands that if he does this thing, he will never again be the person who has not done it. The choice will be permanent. It will close a door inside himself that cannot be reopened. And yet, he goes forward. Because sometimes the anxiety of choice is less unbearable than the anxiety of paralysis. Sometimes a person does the thing they fear precisely because standing on the edge indefinitely is worse than stepping off. That is not courage. But it is also not simple cowardice. It is the human being making the only move that feels available from where they are standing. There is something else in Raskolnikov's pre-crime days that Dostoevsky describes with remarkable precision. The way the decision seems to make itself. He does not sit down and rationally choose. He drifts. He goes to a tavern and overhears a conversation that seems to confirm what he has already been thinking. He walks a route he did not consciously plan to walk. He arrives at a place he told himself he would not go. The mind, when it is moving toward a decision it cannot quite own, does this. It arranges circumstances to make the decision seem to happen to it rather than through it, so that afterward there is something to point to. Something that made this feel inevitable. That, too, is a form of anxiety's work. Not the direct confrontation with choice, but the sidelong approach. The pretending that it was not a choice at all, that the circumstances simply unfolded. Let your jaw be soft. Let the muscles across your chest release a little. Think of a decision you have been circling, not necessarily a large one. Perhaps something that has sat at the edge of your awareness for weeks, approached, retreated from, held, and set down again. The anxiety around it is not the enemy. The anxiety is information. It is telling you that this choice matters, that you have a self that cares about what happens next, that you are not indifferent to your own life. The absence of anxiety before a real choice is not confidence. It is often dissociation, the self stepping back from the equation so it does not have to feel what is at stake. Dostoevsky's most sympathetic characters are anxious. His truly frightening characters are the ones who are not. The dangerous man in his fiction is the one who acts without hesitation, the one who is absolutely certain, the one who has made himself immune to the awareness that he might be wrong. Certainty, in Dostoevsky's world, is almost always a cover story. The person who is never uncertain about a moral question has usually not yet encountered a moral question that was genuinely hard. The anxiety before the choice is the soul registering what is actually at stake. And the stake is always the same question. Who do you want to be? Not in the abstract, in the concrete, specific, this morning, this choice sense. What kind of person do you want to look back on yourself as having been in this particular moment? That question has no comfortable answer. It only has an honest one. And finding the honest answer requires something that anxiety makes very difficult. Stillness. The willingness to stop moving through the problem and simply sit inside it. To let the question be real without immediately looking for the exit, what Dostoevsky found across his entire career was consistent. The people who eventually chose well, the Alyoshas, the Sonias, the elder Zosimas, were not the people who never felt the anxiety. They were the people who felt it most fully and found a way to remain present inside it rather than escaping. The anxiety did not resolve by being suppressed or argued away. It resolved by being inhabited long enough to reveal what was underneath it. Not terror, longing. The longing to be the person you already know yourself capable of being. Chapter 11, The Seduction of Confession. Confession runs through Dostoevsky's work like a river that will not stop. Characters confess to crimes, to sins, to private shames they have carried for decades. to feelings they can barely name, to things they did and things they only imagined doing and things they fear they might one day do. Some confessions are legal, many are not. All of them, in Dostoevsky's telling, have the same root: the unbearable weight of being the only one who knows. There is something specific that happens when a secret lives inside you long enough. It grows, not in size exactly, but in pressure. It takes up more room than it should. It starts to shape the way you move through conversations, through rooms, through relationships. You become slightly careful in ways that are hard to explain. You are always a little aware of what must not appear. And that vigilance, that constant, low-level management of what is visible, is exhausting in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not felt it from the inside. Let your jaw go soft. Let the space behind your eyes relax a little. There is nothing that needs to be kept track of right now. Raskolnikov, after the crime, becomes a man in a glass box. He can see out. People can see in. But he cannot make real contact, because contact would require being present, and being present would require being known, and being known would mean letting the thing he is carrying become visible to someone else. He deteriorates. Not primarily from external pressure. The police are not, for much of the novel, actively pursuing him. He deteriorates from the internal pressure of the secret, from being the only one who knows. And Dostoevsky understood this with such precision because he had carried his own secrets. The years in prison were years he did not, for a long time, discuss in public. The gambling addiction which dominated much of his middle life was a source of private shame he could not easily speak about. His deepest religious doubts, which were profound and genuine, existed alongside his public role as a defender of Russian faith. He knew the cost of being unable to speak, and so his characters keep confessing, not always to the right person, not always at the right time, sometimes in fragments and disguises that obscure more than they reveal, sometimes in ways that shock and destroy, but always moving, however tortuously, in the direction of speech, towards saying, I am this, I have been this, I have done this. There is a quieter layer beneath the obvious meaning of confession. The seduction is not absolution, not, for Dostoevsky, in the simple transactional sense. It is not about being forgiven or let off the hook. It is about the end of the performance. The relief is in no longer maintaining the gap between what is true and what is being shown. In the collapse of that distance, and once you have spoken a thing, once it exists in language between two people rather than only inside one, it has a completely different relationship to you. It is no longer fully private. It has been shared, and sharing changes everything. Not because the fact changes, but because you are no longer alone with it. Sonia, in Crime and Punishment, is the character Raskolnikov eventually confesses to. She is young, living in extreme poverty, supporting her family in a way that has cost her everything. She has every reason to judge him, every reason to be brittle and closed. She hears his confession and does not flinch. She does not absolve him. She tells him he must give himself up. She holds what he has said without being destroyed by it. And in that moment, for the first time in the novel, Raskolnikov is visible, not displayed, not performing, not justifying, simply visible. Dostoevsky seems to be saying that this moment of being held without being condemned is the beginning of the only real healing his characters ever find, not the scent, resolution of the crime, not the punishment, not the moral lesson, the moment of being fully seen and remaining intact. You do not have to confess anything tonight. But if you are carrying something alone, it may be worth knowing that the weight is the secrecy as much as the thing itself. The pressure often lives in the keeping, not in what is kept. Chapter 12, Pride Against Love. There is a wound Dostoevsky kept circling throughout his career. He never gave it a single name, but it appears in character after character, wearing different costumes, always with the same face underneath. The wound of refusing love because accepting it would require admitting that you need it. Pride, in his world, is never simple vanity. It is almost always protective, a way of not being the one who got there first, not being the one who offered and was turned away. Not being the one who was trusting enough to open and then discovered, too late, that the opening was not safe. Let your breath find its own rhythm. Nothing is required of you here. Nastasia Filipovna refuses Mishkin's love not because she does not feel anything for him. She refuses it because being loved purely, without condition, without a hidden price, without the humiliation she has come to expect from intimacy, is outside what she can believe possible for herself. Mishkin offers her something she cannot integrate, and Rogozin, who also loves her the way a person loves a fire, desperately, without the ability to hold it gently. His love is consuming. It confirms the damage she knows about herself. It is the only kind she can quite believe in. The tragedy is not that she makes the wrong choice. It is that she cannot make any other. The wound shapes the options available. This is what Dostoevsky understood about pride. It is not always arrogance. Sometimes it is the armor a person who has been very badly hurt builds to ensure they are never hurt in exactly that way again. The underground man's pride is nearly impenetrable because his sensitivity is immense. He is not indifferent to what people think of him. He is so profoundly responsive to others' opinions that he has had to build an entire philosophy of self-sufficiency just to survive the intensity of caring. His contempt for the world is exactly proportional to his hunger for its acceptance. This is the math that most people, looking from the outside, never see. The person who seems most indifferent is often the person for whom connection is most charged. The person who refuses love most completely is often the person who needs it most specifically. Now, something beneath this is worth sitting with, because pride against love is not only about romance. It is about every form of contact we refuse. The apology that sits in the chest for months rather than being spoken. The gratitude we do not express because expressing it would mean acknowledging that someone mattered. The admission of being wrong that is avoided not because we are certain we are right, but because the admission feels dangerous. All of these are pride operating against the very thing that would relieve us. And Dostoevsky's deepest insight, the one he kept returning to across every major work, was that the relief is always on the other side of the crossing, always on the other side of the moment when pride gives way. Not because that moment is graceful or beautiful, it is often neither. The scenes in his novels where characters break through their own armor are frequently ugly, sobbing, undignified by any conventional standard. But they are alive in a way the performance was not. They are present in a way the distance never allowed. He believed, and this belief grows stronger in his later work, that love is not simply a feeling that passes between people under favorable conditions. It is the basic orientation of the soul toward reality. The soul that loves is the soul that can bear to see things as they actually are, including seeing itself. The soul defended by pride can only see things as they need to be managed, and managing is not the same as living. He knew this from his own experience. He had been proud, and it had cost him relationships and opportunities. He had been humbled by prison, and it had given him back something more valuable. He had spent years oscillating between the two positions, and what he kept writing from inside all of that was a single message in different forms. The love you will not accept is the love that might save you. Not because it is convenient or comfortable, because it is real. Chapter 13, Loneliness in the crowd. St. Petersburg in Dostoevsky's novels is never simply a city. It is a pressure, a character, a condition that shapes everything inside it. The foggy streets, the narrow canals, the stacked apartment buildings where everyone can hear what everyone else is doing and no one knows anything real about anyone else. A city that moves with the speed and indifference of something that has no particular use for the individual interior. Dostoevsky moved to St. Petersburg as a young man, and it marked him in ways that appear on every page he ever wrote. The city was modern, aspirational, European in its ambitions. It was also profoundly inhuman in its daily textures. It rewarded performance and had no patience for the inner life. And in that environment, he watched people become lonely in a way that was specifically urban, specifically modern. Not the loneliness of the hermit in a remote place, the loneliness of someone surrounded at all times by people. Let the next breath settle. Just feel the air moving. The underground man lives in a city of millions and has not one genuine connection. He sees crowds every day, on the streets, in offices, in the restaurant where he is humiliated and is utterly isolated within them. He knows how to navigate social situations. He understands the codes, but he is performing navigation, not experiencing contact. And there is a particular weight to that distinction. To be in a room full of people and feel the absence of anything real is a specific and difficult experience. It is different from being physically alone. In many ways, it is harder because the company highlights the absence of contact rather than excusing it. This is the form of loneliness Dostoevsky was most interested in. Not geographic isolation, existential isolation. And the modern world has since perfected the conditions that produce it. We have more communication technology than any civilization in history. We are surrounded at all times by the visible lives of other people, their announcements and their achievements and their carefully curated images. And many people feel more unknown now than their grandparents did in places they could never leave. The form has changed. The underground is larger. The mechanism is the same. Dostoevsky's characters move through crowds and remain untouched by them. They are present in a purely technical sense. Interiorly, they are elsewhere, translating everything that happens into evidence about themselves rather than experiencing genuine contact with whoever is in front of them. This is not simply a character flaw. It is a response to an environment that was not designed for the interior life. An environment that rewards the performance of connection without creating the actual conditions for it. Real connection requires slowness, requires imperfection, requires the willingness to be boring and human and slightly awkward in front of another person and to let them see you anyway. The city has no use for boring and human, and so the lonely person in the crowd becomes very good at the performance and more alienated from the substance. You may recognize this pattern without having read a word of Dostoevsky. The evening when you were in a room full of people you liked and noticed, partway through, that you were performing your engagement with them rather than actually being engaged, that a part of you was monitoring how you were coming across, adjusting, ensuring the impression was landing, while another part of you was somewhere else entirely, waiting for the occasion to end so you could be alone with the actual experience of yourself. That is the underground man's dilemma in modern clothes. Not a failure of love for the people around you, not shyness or misanthropy, something more specific. The gap between the surface layer of interaction, which you can manage competently, even warmly, and the place where genuine contact would actually occur. Dostoevsky was not writing about this to diagnose or to condemn. He was writing about it because he believed that naming a condition is the first step toward no longer being entirely governed by it. To see the performance is not yet to stop the performance, but it is to create a small distance from it. A breath of space between the automatic response and the possible one. There is a moment in the middle of Dostoevsky's life when this changed for him. In Siberia, in the prison camp, there was no performance possible. He sat with men who were brutal and men who were gentle, and men who were both at different times of day. He could not curate his impression. He was too exhausted, too cold, too hungry. And in that absence of performance, something happened that he had not anticipated. He began to see the other prisoners as people, not as types, not as social categories, not as examples of something, as specific, particular, unrepeatable individuals who had arrived at their circumstances by roads that, when honestly examined, were not entirely different from his own. He wrote later that this period, for all its difficulty, had given him what no amount of intellectual achievement could have provided on its own: the knowledge of the human heart from the inside, not theorized, felt. And this is the gift that loneliness, when it is fully entered and honestly inhabited, sometimes carries within it, not the loneliness of turning away from life, the loneliness of sitting still inside the isolation long enough to discover what it is actually made of, not the absence of others, the presence of yourself. Chapter 14. The Need to be Seen. There is a best moment in Notes from Underground that is almost unbearable to read. The underground man has gone, humiliated, to a brothel in St. Petersburg. He meets a young woman named Liza. And in the middle of this entirely transactional, degraded encounter, he does something unexpected. He talks to her honestly, not at her, not the performed cynicism he maintains everywhere else. He speaks to her in a way that is genuine, even tender. He describes what her life will become if she remains in this place. He is compassionate and precise, and, for those few paragraphs, something close to the person he might have been if things had gone differently. And Liza is moved. She believes him. She comes to his apartment days later looking for the connection that his words had seemed to promise. And he, in terror, destroys it. He humiliates her. He sends her away with deliberate cruelty. He undoes everything he had offered, because the need to be seen was real. But the capacity to bear being seen without destroying what was looking at him was more than he could hold. Let your shoulders settle. The air is moving in and out without your management. The need to be seen is one of the most fundamental human needs and one of the least openly acknowledged. We discuss needs for food and shelter and belonging. These have entered the vocabulary of self-understanding, but the need to be specifically seen, known in your particularity, by another person who takes the knowing seriously, who holds what they see without flinching, is at the heart of most of what Dostoevsky's characters are suffering from. The underground man needs to be seen. He arranges the entire sad drama of his life to force moments of recognition that he then cannot tolerate when they arrive. Nastasia Filipovna needs to be seen. She destroys every relationship that might offer it because she cannot believe that the seeing will be followed by staying. Raskolnikov needs to be seen. His crime is, among many other things, an attempt to force visibility, to make legible to the world what he believes himself to be. Not an ordinary student in a small room, but something capable of extraordinary things. The irony in each case is that the behavior driven by the need to be seen makes genuine seeing impossible. The underground man's contempt keeps people at the distance where they cannot see him clearly. Nastasia's self-destruction confirms the verdict she fears rather than disproving it. Raskolnikov's transgression makes him visible in the worst possible way, not as the extraordinary person he imagined, but as a man with a terrible secret. This is the trap Dostoevsky kept drawing. The need is real, the strategy is self-defeating, and the gap between them is where the character lives and suffers, and eventually, if they are fortunate, begins to find another way. The other way, in his fiction, is always the same. It is not achieving visibility through performance or achievement or transgression. It is allowing yourself to be visible in your ordinary, imperfect, unimpressive truth. To let another person see the confusion alongside the intelligence, the fear alongside the confidence, the longing alongside the contempt. This is what Sonia offers Raskolnikov. This is what the elder Zosima offers everyone who comes to him. This is what Alyosha offers his brothers across the entire length of the Kam. Brothers Karamazov, not approval, not the assurance of their virtue, just the steady presence of someone who will look and not look away. Think of the last time someone saw you, not the version you had prepared, but the actual you, the one that is tired and uncertain and privately convinced it is not quite enough. The one that moves through most days behind a performance thin enough to feel the cold air coming through it. The moment when that version of yourself was accidentally visible. Some people carry those moments as shame. The mask slipped, something real showed. But something else is also true of those moments. They are often the ones that created the most actual contact with another person, the most genuine conversation, the most lasting sense of being in the presence of someone rather than beside them. The underground man's tragedy is not that his need to be seen is too large, it is that he cannot survive its fulfillment. He is so convinced that genuine visibility will end in rejection that he preempts the rejection by performing it himself. He pushes people away before they can leave, which means he never discovers whether they would have left. Dostoevsky gave his readers no simple comfort about this, only the observation that the hunger is universal, that it is not a flaw, and that somewhere in the long, difficult work of learning to let ourselves be known, imperfections included, confusion included, the fear itself included, something becomes possible that cannot be reached any other way. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. You are here, and here is enough for now. That kind of witness is rare, but it is, for Dostoevsky, the only thing that actually heals the wound at the center. Not resolution, not judgment, not justice in the abstract sense. The simple, transformative experience of being known and remaining intact. of being seen clearly in your full, complicated humanity and not destroyed. Chapter 15. Compassion for the Fallen. One of the strangest and most quietly beautiful things about Dostoevsky is the quality of attention he directs toward the people his world had decided to discard: murderers, prostitutes, compulsive gamblers, alcoholics, failed idealists, broken men in labor camps who had done things that could not be taken back. He did not sentimentalize them. He did not pretend they had not done what they had done. He did not manufacture convenient innocence for anyone, but he looked with the kind of sustained, serious, patient attention that most people reserve for people they have already decided are worth their time. And what he found every time was a person, not a symbol, not a warning, not a social problem to be managed. A person. Let your breath be easy. There is nothing you need to do with this. He had learned to look this way in Siberia. He arrived in the prison camp as a young man who had spent his life primarily among educated people, intellectuals, writers, the socially respectable. He had good politics about the poor and the criminal class. He believed in their dignity in the abstract as political philosophy. But he had not spent much time actually among people whose lives had broken in the specific ways that led to a Siberian labor camp. What he found there dismantled his abstractions completely. There was a man who had murdered a fellow soldier over a 10-ruble debt. There was a man who had committed a crime of passion so extreme it seemed theatrical. There were men who had acted out of desperation, men who had acted out of calculation, men whose crimes made no immediate sense by any logic Dostoevsky could initially construct. But when he sat with these men, when he stopped theorizing and started simply observing, he found something he had not expected. The crimes had contexts, not excuses, contexts. Childhoods that had trained specific responses. Injuries that had never been named. Moments where the only visible option had been the wrong one. And underneath all of it, the same basic interior structure as his own, the same capacity for tenderness alongside violence, for shame alongside bravado, for longing alongside destruction. He came out of prison with a different relationship to the concept of the fallen, not a softer relationship exactly, not a more permissive one, but a more honest one. He had stopped believing that fallen people were a different species. He had started believing they were people in whom the universal human struggles had arrived with more force, or less protection, or fewer resources for managing what came. This did not make the crimes smaller. It made the criminals larger, more human, more worthy of a genuine response rather than a categorical dismissal. The compassion he developed was not comfortable or distant. It was not the theoretical compassion of the man who has never stood close enough to fall. It was the compassion of someone who understood from inside his own experience what it felt like to be reduced, to be stripped of every protective layer, to discover that the self you thought you were was, in part, a performance made possible by favorable conditions. Take away the conditions, and something raw appears. He had been that raw. He had been seen in that state by other people who were equally raw. And what had surprised him, looking back, was not how terrible the exposure was. It was how, in that mutual exposure, something like dignity had survived, even flourished. Dostoevsky's most radical conviction, the one that ran against the grain of most thinking in his time, was that the fallen person retained their full humanity, not despite the fall, not after recovery from it, during it, inside it, in the wreckage. The full human being was still present, still worth sitting with, still capable of love, of conscience, of the small gestures of care that mean everything between people who have nothing material to offer. That is what he brought back from Siberia, and it is the lens through which, if you choose it, you might consider the parts of yourself that have fallen, not with shame, with the same patient, serious, unglamorous compassion he gave his characters. Think of something in yourself that you have categorized as a failure, not the ordinary kind of shortcoming that everyone has and everyone discusses, the deeper kind, the version of yourself that behaved in ways you are still not entirely at peace with, the chapter of your life that you move past quickly when the story comes up. Dostoevsky's argument is not that what happened was good or that it did not cost what it cost. His argument is that the person you were in that chapter was not a different species from the person you are now. They were you in specific circumstances, with the specific resources and the specific injuries and the specific blindnesses you carried at that time. And if you were to look at that person with the quality of attention he brought to Sonia, to Dmitri, to the men in the labor camp whose crimes he could not excuse and whose humanity he could not deny, what would you see? Not a verdict, a person. The same capacity for longing and for smallness, for love and for error, that every other human interior contains. The compassion he developed was not comfortable or distant. It was not the theoretical compassion of the man who has never stood close enough to fall. It was the compassion of someone who understood from inside his own experience what it felt like to be reduced, to be stripped of every protective layer, to discover that the self you thought you were was, in part, a performance made possible by favorable conditions. Take away the conditions, and something raw appears. He had been that raw. He had been seen in that state by other people who were equally raw. And what had surprised him, looking back, was not how terrible the exposure was. It was how, in that mutual exposure, something like dignity had survived, even flourished. Dostoevsky's most radical conviction, the one that ran against the grain of most thinking in his time, was that the fallen person retained their full humanity, not despite the fall, not after recovery from it, during it, inside it. In the wreckage, the full human being was still present, still worth sitting with, still capable of love, of conscience, of the small gestures of care that mean everything between people who have nothing material to offer. That is what he brought back from Siberia, and it is the lens through which, if you choose it, you might consider the parts of yourself that have fallen, not with shame, with the same patient, serious, unglamorous compassion he gave his characters. Chapter 16, Punishment Without Prison, the 22nd of December, 1849, St. Petersburg. A public square called Semyonovskaya. It is cold in the way Russian winter is cold, not just temperature, but a pervasive heaviness that enters everything and offers no negotiation. Dostoevsky is 27 years old. He has been in prison for 8 months. He has been found guilty of involvement with the Petrushevsky Circle, the group of young men who passed around banned books and discussed what a more just Russia might look like. He is standing in a row of men who have also been condemned. The sentence is death. The scaffold has been built. The priests have offered the last rites. The men have been told precisely how little time remains. And then, after they have stood in the cold long enough for the truth of it to enter completely, a messenger arrives. The Tsar, in his mercy, has commuted the sentence. They will go to Siberia instead. Let the room be completely still for a moment. Let the body settle. Dostoevsky wrote about this experience in letters and in fiction for the rest of his life. He could not stop returning to it. Not because it traumatized him in the way we might expect, but because it had revealed something to him that no other experience could have shown him. Standing before the rifles, knowing that the next few minutes were the last ones available, he experienced time differently than he ever had. Each second was separate, complete, whole in itself. The cold air was not simply cold, it was air being breathed in a body that was alive, that had been alive for 27 years and would, in a few moments, no longer be. He wrote to his brother, in the letter he sent shortly after the commutation, about what a strange and clarifying gift that moment had been. Not the fear, not the approach of death, but the absolute precision of attention that came with it. The knowledge that life, the ordinary life of ordinary days, was not something to be endured until something better arrived. It was the thing itself, the whole thing. Every unremarkable hour of it, he walked away from that square a different writer. The young man's literary ambition, his social anxiety, his idealistic politics, these were still present. But underneath them, something had been added that could not be taken away. The knowledge held in the body, not just in the mind, that to be alive is already the extraordinary thing. This is the story we planted at the beginning of our conversation. The firing squad did not break him, It resolved him. It burned away a layer of performance and left something simpler underneath. A person who knew in his bones what mattered. A writer who could never again be satisfied with clever surface observations when the full depth of human experience was so clearly visible, if you were willing to look. Now here is what punishment without prison means for the rest of us. Raskolnikov's real punishment is not the 8 years he eventually serves in Siberia. His real punishment is the months before his confession, when he moves through St. Petersburg with the weight of what he has done pressing on every moment, when food has no taste, when no conversation is genuine. When the mind that was always his most prized possession has turned completely against him, the punishment is in the interior, as it always is. The soul has its own accounting. It does not wait for courts or sentences. It begins immediately in the minutes after the transgression, and it does not stop until something settles. And what settles it, in Dostoevsky's telling, is not punishment in the external sense. It is acknowledgement. The moment when the arguing stops, when the underground man or Raskolnikov or the proud man finally stops contesting what he knows to be true and simply says, "Yes, this happened, this is what I am, this is what I have been carrying," that is when the interior sentence ends. Not because the past changes, because the resistance to it does. Chapter 17. Suffering as Psychology. Dostoevsky died in 1881. The field we now call psychology would not formally exist for another decade. And yet, modern psychologists keep returning to his work, not as historical curiosity, as clinical insight. William James, one of the founders of American psychology, writing at the turn of the century, called Dostoevsky the greatest psychological novelist who had ever lived. He meant something specific by that. He meant that Dostoevsky had described with extraordinary accuracy the inner machinery of minds under stress, the ways consciousness fragments, the ways shame distorts perception, the ways the will can be simultaneously present and completely paralyzed. More recently, researchers studying trauma, shame, and the nervous system have found in his characters descriptions that map almost precisely onto what neuroscience is now able to demonstrate. Let your shoulders settle. Let the muscles along your back release a little. Here is the echo of the question we began with. Two kinds of suffering. The psychiatrist and trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk, who spent decades studying what happens to people who have been through extreme experiences, describes what occurs when painful experience is not processed. When it is suppressed, denied, or simply too overwhelming to integrate, the experience does not disappear. It is stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of attention and reaction that a person carries without knowing exactly where they came from. The body keeps what the mind will not hold. This is Dostoevsky's underground men, his imprisoned characters, his humiliated and insulted People who carry the unprocessed weight of what happened to them in their reflexes, their vigilance, their inability to be fully present without the past arriving uninvited. That is the first kind of suffering, the suffering that has not been witnessed, named, or moved through, the suffering that stays. The second kind is different. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and built an entire psychology from what he observed there, found that the people who were best equipped to endure what they could not escape were the ones who found some way to give their suffering a place in a larger story. Not to justify it, not to make it fair or secretly good, but to give it a relationship to something that extended beyond the suffering itself, meaning changed the relationship to what could not be changed. Dostoevsky had arrived at something similar in a different crucible decades earlier. The characters who survive in his work, not physically, but spiritually, are the ones who find a way to use their suffering rather than simply endure it. There is a practical difference between these two approaches that the body registers before the mind does. The person who is merely enduring suffering holds themselves slightly apart from it, brace, waiting for it to stop, measuring themselves against a version of their life in which this is not happening. The distance they maintain from the experience is the same distance that makes the experience impossible to process and impossible to leave. The person who has turned toward their suffering, who has allowed it to be fully real, to land completely, to have its actual weight in the body and in the mind, is paradoxically closer to the place where something shifts. Not because suffering is secretly good, it is not. Dostoevsky never argued that. But because the suffering that is fully entered eventually reveals something that endurance never reaches, the specific, irreducible knowledge of what it is like to be human at the limit. And from that knowledge, something becomes possible that comfort and protection never produce. Raskolnikov's years in Siberia, which should be the most miserable chapters of his story, become instead the beginning of something real. Because for the first time, he is not performing. He is simply suffering. And in the simplicity of real suffering, without the overlay of theory and pride, something in him begins to soften. The elder Zosima, who has, by the time we meet him, become a figure of extraordinary gentleness, carries within him a history of violence and shame that he has not denied. He has integrated it. His suffering became the ground of his compassion, not because suffering is secretly good, but because he allowed it to teach him rather than simply break him. This is the distinction Dostoevsky was drawing for 30 years. Suffering that is resisted, suppressed, or performed never fully resolves. Suffering that is entered honestly, felt completely, named accurately, sat with rather than fled from, eventually transforms into something else, not into something painless, into something useful, into depth, into the capacity to sit with another person's pain without flinching because you have been inside your own. This is what he found in Siberia. What the firing squad prepared him for. What the prison camp delivered. Slowly, over 4 years, he emerged at 33, carrying something he had not had before. Not certainty, not resolution, not the answers to the questions, depth and depth. In Dostoevsky's world, people is the only form of wealth that cannot be taken away. Chapter 18. The Soul in Rebellion. Ivan Karamazov is the most dangerous character Dostoevsky ever created. Not because he is violent, he is not. He is a brilliantly intelligent young man who reads philosophy, argues with precision, and loves his younger brother Alyosha with a fierceness that surprises even him. He is dangerous because his arguments are genuinely strong. Ivan rejects God. Not because he has not thought carefully about the question, because he has thought about it more rigorously than most people who believe. He can articulate the case for faith with more skill than most believers bring to their own position. And then he refuses it anyway, not because of abstract philosophical doubt, because of one specific thing he cannot accept: the suffering of innocent children. Let the air be quiet around you, just listen. Ivan poses the question with devastating clarity. If God is good and omnipotent, and if faith requires us to accept the overall justice of existence despite the presence of evil, then what do we do with a child who has done nothing and suffers terribly anyway? He presents historical accounts, specific, named instances of children who were tortured, not the large, abstract suffering of populations, the particular, irreducible, unnecessary suffering of individual children who could not have deserved what happened to them. And then he says, if the price of the final harmony is the tears of even one such child, then I return the ticket. I will not participate in that accounting. This is Ivan's rebellion, and Dostoevsky, who believed deeply in God and in the Russian Orthodox tradition, put this argument in Ivan's mouth with full intellectual force. He did not soften it. He did not provide an easy counter. He made it as strong as it could possibly be, because Dostoevsky had felt the same rebellion. He had been in a prison camp where the consequences of human cruelty were visible every day. He had written long before the brothers Karamazov about children born into poverty and violence and chaos through no choice of their own. His faith was not the faith of someone who had avoided the hard question. It was a faith on the other side of the hard question. And something beneath Ivan's rebellion is worth seeing clearly. The soul in rebellion is not the soul without faith. It is often the soul most desperately hungry for something to believe in. Ivan's rejection is not indifference. It is the opposite. He cares so much that he cannot accept an inadequate account of the suffering he sees. He holds existence to a higher standard than the comfortable believer who has not fully faced the problem. His rebellion is a form of love. Dostoevsky understood this completely, and he did not answer Ivan with a counter-argument. He did not write a philosophical rebuttal to the Grand Inquisitor. He answered Ivan with Alyosha, not with philosophy, with a life. The life of a person who has also seen the suffering and also cannot explain it, and who, despite that, keeps choosing love. Who keeps choosing openness when closing would be so much easier? Not because the argument is won, because the alternative, closing the heart, protecting the self from the full reality of other people's pain, is, for Alyosha, simply not available. The rebellion and the faith live side by side in the brothers Karamazov, unresolved. Dostoevsky did not believe they could be resolved. Not cleanly, not by any argument currently available. He believed they could be inhabited. And there is something else that happens to Ivan, quietly, at the edges of the novel. Having made the purest possible case for rebellion, having articulated the refusal to participate in an arrangement that permits innocent suffering, Ivan begins to deteriorate, not because he was wrong about the suffering, but because the position of refusal, sustained long enough, begins to hollow out the person who holds it. Rebellion against life's terms, taken to its logical conclusion, leads not to freedom, but to a particular kind of imprisonment. The imprisonment of a self that has cut off the one thing that could have saved it. Connection. The willingness to be changed by what it encounters. The openness that Alyosha carries without any philosophical justification. Ivan is brilliant. He is also, as the novel progresses, increasingly alone in the most interior sense. Dostoevsky was not punishing him. He was tracing the consequences. The person who has decided that no relationship with reality is possible on acceptable terms eventually discovers that they have made themselves unable to have a relationship with anything at all. The rebellion and the faith live side by side in the brothers Karamazov, unresolved. Dostoevsky did not believe they could be resolved. Not cleanly, not by any argument currently available. He believed they could be inhabited. The person who has looked honestly at the world's suffering and at their own, and who still chooses, in some way, to remain open, to remain present, to extend toward another human being rather than retreating into certainty or bitterness, that person is not naive. They are holding a question that has no clean answer and choosing relationship with reality over the comfort of a settled position. That is, in Dostoevsky's understanding, the bravest thing available. Chapter 19. Addiction to extremes. Dostoevsky was a gambler, not casually, desperately, obsessively, in a way that cost him everything, repeatedly, for decades. He would receive a publisher's advance, travel to Europe, and find himself at the roulette tables within days. He would lose the advance. He would borrow from friends, He would write frantic, humiliating letters begging for anything that could get him through one more week. Then he would win a small amount and lose it all by morning. He was not proud of this. He wrote about it with the same unflinching honesty he applied to everything else in The Gambler. Written in an extraordinary 10 days to meet a publisher's contractual deadline, dictated to the stenographer who would eventually become his second wife, he described the psychology of compulsive gambling with a precision that clinical literature would not match for another century. Let your body settle. Let the air around you be still. What he found in himself and in his fictional gambler was not pleasure in the ordinary sense. It was the edge. The moment when the ball is still spinning and the outcome is genuinely unknown is the moment of feeling most present, most real. Everything else, the debt, the relationship at risk, the unfinished manuscript, dissolves in that suspended instant. And what replaces it is an intensity of experience that ordinary, comfortable, safely managed life cannot produce. This is the logic of addiction to extremes. It is not, at its root, about the substance or the specific behavior. It is about the only reliable route to aliveness that the person has found. The gambler is not stupid. He is not without will. He is someone whose nervous system has learned through experience that the only place where the fog reliably lifts and colors return and the body stops going through the motions is at the edge. At the moment where everything is genuinely at stake, Dostoevsky knew this feeling intimately. He also knew with equal clarity that it was destroying him. Think of someone, yourself, perhaps, or someone close to you, who lives more comfortably at the edge than in the middle, who is most alive in a crisis, who creates urgency when urgency is not strictly necessary, who understands at some level that the extreme is where they most reliably feel real. This is not a simple character flaw. It is often the response of a highly sensitive person who has found that ordinary stimulation does not quite reach the depth where they actually live. The middle range of experience, the comfortable, the routine, the manageable, sometimes feels like a kind of numbness to people whose interior lives are very large. What is remarkable about the second half of Dostoevsky's life is that he found other edges. Writing was 1. Not the comfortable professional writing of someone who has mastered a craft and delivers it cleanly. The writing of someone who takes on more than can possibly be completed, who promises deadlines that cannot be met, who fills every page with questions that have no certain answers, and then fills them with the best available truth anyway. The Brothers Karamazov, his last and greatest novel, was written at 60, while he was dying of a lung condition, having outlived 2 of his children, having stood before a firing squad and survived a labor camp and lost everything to gambling and rebuilt everything through Anna's extraordinary patience. He approached its questions about God, about suffering, about love, with the same quality of intensity he had once brought to the roulette wheel. Everything was at stake, because, for him, Everything always had been. The edge he eventually found was not less extreme. It was directed differently. And the question that emerges from his life, for anyone who recognizes something of themselves in it, is a useful one. What is the aliveness you are actually searching for? And is the current path the only road that leads there? Think of the moments in your own life when the fog has lifted, when you were most present, most awake, most genuinely engaged with what was happening. For some people, it is a crisis, the emergency that clarifies instantly what matters and what does not. For some people, it is creation, the writing, the building, the making of something that did not exist before. For some people, it is a conversation that goes somewhere unexpected. The moment when what you thought was a surface exchange becomes suddenly real. The edge is different for every person. The aliveness it produces is recognizable to all of them. What Dostoevsky found is that the aliveness itself is not the problem. The search for it is not a flaw. What matters is whether the path chosen to reach it opens toward the rest of life or closes off everything else in order to sustain the intensity. The roulette wheel gave him the edge at the cost of everything surrounding it. The writing gave him the edge in a form that built over decades into something the world still holds. The same hunger, a completely different direction. That distinction may be the most practical thing he ever discovered. Chapter 20. Innocence beside Cruelty. Prince Mishkin, the protagonist of The Idiot, is in many ways the strangest character in all of Dostoevsky's fiction. He is genuinely kind, not performed kindness, the social lubricant that keeps relationships functioning smoothly. Not strategic kindness, the kind that calculates its investment. Actual, undefended, uncalculating kindness. The kind that does not measure what it costs because it is simply not oriented that way. He is also epileptic, which in Dostoevsky's time carried both heavy social stigma and, in certain religious traditions, a kind of sacred association. The person who falls and returns, who crosses the threshold of ordinary consciousness and comes back carrying something from the other side. Dostoevsky was himself epileptic. Mishkin is his most personal projection into fiction, and what he attempted with Mishkin was something very difficult: to place absolute innocence, not naivety, not inexperience, but genuine open-heartedness inside a world that had absolutely no capacity to hold it. Let the air be soft. Let the body settle into whatever position it has found. Rogozhin, who moves through the novel in parallel to Mishkin, is his structural opposite. He is passionate, impulsive, possessive, capable of violence in ways that Mishkin is entirely not. He loves Nastasia Filipovna with a devouring intensity that he cannot govern. His love is real. No one who reads the novel seriously doubts that. But it is real in the way that a fire is real. It consumes, rather than holds. Dostoevsky puts these two figures together, two men who love the same woman in completely different ways, and watches what happens when innocence and cruelty occupy the same space. What happens is not simple. Rogozhin is drawn to Mishkin despite himself. He is suspicious of him, jealous of him, at one point makes an attempt on his life. And yet, he also needs him in the way that a person who has never been close to genuine gentleness needs to know that it exists in the world. He cannot become Mishkin. He is not built for it. But the proximity to something he cannot be creates in him a longing that might be the most honest thing he ever feels. And Mishkin is drawn to Rogozhin in ways that are also not simple. He does not fear the passion. He does not flinch from the darkness. He seems to understand, in the way only someone without defensive armor can, that Rogozhin's violence is the other face of a love so intense it has nowhere adequate to go. The novel ends in disaster. Innocence beside cruelty does not reform the cruelty. It illuminates it, but it cannot transform it on its own. Dostoevsky was not suggesting that innocence is either useless or sufficient. He was suggesting something more complicated, that the person who remains open without becoming naive, who maintains the capacity for genuine contact without armoring against pain, lives in a fundamentally different relationship to reality than the protected person. They see more, they suffer more. They are also capable of more genuine love, more actual presence with another human being. The cost is high. Mishkin is broken by a world he cannot stop engaging with. But Dostoevsky seems to regard him, for all his tragedy, as having lived more completely than any of the harder, more defended characters who survive him. There is a scene early in The Idiot where Mishkin arrives at the Epanchin household, a powerful general's family, as a complete stranger with no money, no social position, and extraordinary claims about his own lowly circumstances. He simply sits among them and speaks directly, without calculation, about what he sees and what he feels. The family is initially suspicious, then baffled. Then, before they quite understand how it has happened, genuinely moved. Because Mishkin's directness is not naivety, he is not unaware of social norms. He simply does not perform any distance from what is real. He speaks from his actual interior to whoever is in front of him. He treats every person as someone whose interior matters. And in a society organized entirely around the management of impression, this is experienced as something between refreshing and alarming. People do not know how to respond to someone who is not performing. They keep trying to find the angle, the agenda, the thing he is after. And there is no angle, he is simply there. This is not a comfortable idea. It does not make a comfortable moral. The open person is more vulnerable and more alive. The question is not whether innocence beside cruelty survives. The question is what it witnesses. what it illuminates, what the darkness looks like when there is someone nearby who has not learned to look away from it. Chapter 21. The Holy Fool. There is a tradition in Russian Orthodox Christianity called the Eurodivy. It translates roughly as Holy Fool or Fool in Christ. The Eurodivy was a figure who deliberately adopted the appearance of madness, who behaved strangely, spoke in riddles, dressed in rags, flouted every social convention in order to speak truths that no one else was permitted to say. They were immune to social pressure because they had placed themselves entirely outside the system of social reward and punishment. They could tell a Tsar he was wrong. They could say the thing that everyone else was pretending not to know. And because they had no status to protect, they had access to a freedom that the powerful and the respectable could not reach. There was a specific holy fool in 16th century Moscow named Basil, who was considered so sacred that even the Tsar Ivan the Terrible visited him seeking counsel. Basil walked barefoot through the streets in winter. He gave away whatever he was given. He wept in front of the Tsar's palace, not because he was afraid of the Tsar, but because he was mourning the souls of those the Tsar had killed. He was not pretending to be powerless. He had chosen a life in which power, in the conventional sense, was simply not the point. And Dostoevsky found in this tradition something that spoke to one of his deepest convictions, that the person who is truly free from social performance, who has let go of reputation, of the need to be regarded well, of the constant self-monitoring that educated urban society required, can see more clearly than anyone else. Because they are no longer looking through the distorting lens of how things will appear. Dostoevsky was deeply drawn to this figure. Let your breath settle, let the body be heavy. There is nothing to manage right now. The archetype appears throughout his fiction in various forms. Mishkin is one version. The man who behaves in ways that the society around him considers simple or strange, but who sees with uncomfortable clarity the things that the socially adept are too invested in their own performance to notice. Alyosha is another. He is gentle in a world that rewards hardness, patient in a world that values efficiency, honest in a way that makes people around him uncomfortable, not because his honesty is cruel, but because they can feel that he is not performing it. He simply is it. And the elder Zosima, Alyosha's teacher, is the fullest expression of the type. Zosima has arrived at his wisdom by way of real violence and real shame, and a long period of ordinary corruption. He is not innocent. He has been through the full range of what it means to be human and to fail at it. But on the other side of all of that, he has arrived at something that looks, from the outside, like simplicity. He bows before prisoners. He refuses to judge the person in front of him. He says things that are obvious, and yet that nobody else has thought to say. He is not naive. He is not simple. He is free. Free in the way the underground man cannot be, not because he has escaped his history, but because he has walked all the way through it and kept walking. The holy fool carries no illusions about what the world is. They have looked at it directly, without protection, without the buffer of theory or status or carefully maintained reputation, and they are not shocked by what they find. And precisely because they are not shocked, they can be kind. Kindness, in Dostoevsky's understanding, does not flourish in ignorance of human darkness. It flourishes in people who have looked at the darkness without flinching and found, on the other side of looking, that it does not preclude love. The holy fool is the person who has lost everything they were protecting: reputation, certainty, the comfortable story about themselves, and discovered that the self they were protecting it for is still there, still capable of being present to another person's pain, still capable of love that does not require the other person to be worthy of it first. This is not a model most people can follow deliberately. You cannot decide to become the holy fool. The archetype is less a prescription than a direction. It is pointing toward the quality of attention that becomes available when a person stops managing their reputation and starts attending to what is actually in front of them. What is actually in front of you right now, in the quiet of this hour, the weight of your own body, the fact that you are breathing, the small and actual reality of this moment, which does not require you to perform anything at all. The holy fool knows this moment is enough, not because it solves anything, because it is real. Chapter 22. Brothers of Rage and Faith. Brothers Karamazov is, among many other things, a portrait of what happens when three profoundly different ways of being human must share the same blood and the same history. Dmitri is passion. He is the oldest brother, impulsive and generous, capable of enormous tenderness and enormous violence, living almost entirely at the level of immediate feeling. He argues, overspends, loves dramatically, suffers loudly. He is impossible and magnetic in roughly equal measure. Ivan is reason. He is the middle brother, the intellectual, the one who builds systems and argues with precision and refuses anything he cannot account for with his intelligence. He has placed himself above ordinary feeling through the force of his brilliance, and it is destroying him slowly in ways he cannot yet see. Alyosha is faith. Not the simple faith of someone who has not looked at the hard questions. Faith that has absorbed doubt and remained open anyway. He moves through the novel like a still point. He does not argue with Ivan's philosophy. He does not try to manage Dmitri's passions. He simply remains present to whoever is in front of him. Let the next breath be slow, just a little. Dostoevsky had brothers. He understood the strange alchemy of people formed by the same parents, the same household, the same basic conditions, and yet arriving at completely different relationships to existence. What the novel does with the Karamazovs is show these three orientations: passion, reason, faith, not as a hierarchy where one is clearly superior to the others, but as different responses to the same unbearable human condition. All three are trying to answer the same question: How do you live when you know it ends? How do you love when love so reliably leads to loss? How do you choose when the choice is real and has consequences you cannot see in advance? Dimitri's answer is, live at full volume. Feel everything. If it ends, let it end loudly. He is not wrong that intensity is one genuine form of being alive. Ivan's answer is, understand everything you can. If you comprehend the system clearly enough, perhaps you can be protected from the worst of it. He is not wrong that intelligence is real and has real value. Alyosha's answer is, remain open. Do not defend the self against what is real. Let the weight of the world in, because the alternative, to be protected and hollow, is worse than the pain of contact. He is not wrong either. What Dostoevsky seems to suggest is that each of these orientations contains a genuine truth, and that none of them alone is sufficient. The person who is only passion burns out or destroys what they love. The person who is only reason severs from life and eventually from themselves. The person who is only faith, without ever engaging the darkness directly, risks a kind of spiritual comfort that has not been truly tested. The whole person needs some of each, needs to feel deeply, the way Dmitri does, without being consumed by feeling. Needs to think clearly, the way Ivan does, without becoming frozen by thought. Needs to remain open, the way Alyosha does, without becoming passive before what is actually wrong. This is the psychological map that Dostoevsky drew most clearly in his last and greatest work. Not a prescription, a map. And maps are useful not because they tell you where to go, but because they help you understand where you currently are. Where are you in the territory of the Karamazovs? Is there one brother who feels more familiar than the others? There is no right answer to that question, but sitting with it gently in the quiet of this hour might tell you something worth knowing about the balance currently available in your own interior. Consider the moments when you have acted most like Dmitri, the times when feeling overran everything else. When the impulse arrived before the thought and you followed it, sometimes into something that surprised you with its warmth and generosity, sometimes into something that cost you more than you expected. Dmitri does not regret feeling. He regrets the occasions when feeling outran wisdom. The distinction is worth holding. Consider the moments when you have acted most like Ivan, the times when intelligence became a barrier rather than a bridge, when the very precision of your thinking about a situation protected you from having to be fully present inside it, when the model of the experience became more real than the experience. Ivan does not regret thinking. He regrets the times when thought became a substitute for contact with what was real. And consider the moments when something in you has acted most like Alyosha, the times when you were simply present to another person, when you did not try to solve, to analyze, to improve, when you just were there. Those moments are usually small, unremarked, not the occasions you would recall as significant. And yet the people who were on the receiving end of them may remember them as something they needed. Dostoevsky's argument is not that Alyosha is correct and his brothers are wrong. It is that the conversation between all three of them is the most important conversation available. That the full human being holds something of each: the capacity to feel, the capacity to think, the capacity to remain open, and that the work of a life is finding the balance that does not sacrifice one at the altar of the others. Where are you in the territory of the Karamazovs? Is there one brother who feels more familiar than the others? There is no right answer to that question. Chapter 23, Doubt at the Edge. Ivan Karamazov does not simply disbelieve. He interrogates the question with a seriousness that goes beyond the casual dismissal of someone who has simply not been paying attention. His doubt is engaged, passionate. It costs him something. It keeps him awake in ways that no comfortable certainty would. And this is the kind of doubt Dostoevsky found most interesting. Not the doubt of the person who has never seriously entertained the question, but the doubt of the person who has looked at it from every angle, who has felt the full weight of what is at stake, and who still cannot say yes without a sense that they are being asked to close their eyes. There is a particular quality of honesty in this. Let your breath be easy. Feel the stillness of the air around you. The elder Zosima, who is Ivan's philosophical opposite in the novel, does not try to defeat Ivan's argument. He does not engage the Grand Inquisitor scenario on its own terms. He responds instead with presence, with the accumulated quality of his own life, with the evidence of a person who has also doubted and also suffered and also found on the other side of all of that, not certainty, but something more stable: trust. Trust is not the same as certainty. Certainty says, I know how this works. The logic is sound. The math checks out. Trust says, I cannot see where this leads. I cannot make the suffering make sense by any accounting that satisfies me. I cannot explain the tears of children to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. And yet I find, when I am most honest, that something in me opens toward life rather than closing against it. That something keeps moving forward rather than stopping at the edge. Dostoevsky himself lived inside this tension for his entire adult life. He was publicly identified with Russian Orthodox faith and wrote with genuine sympathy for religious belief. And yet his notebooks and private correspondence show a man who asked the hard questions without the settled comfort of having answered them, who found, in the practice of faith without certainty, something that felt more honest than either confident belief or comfortable secular dismissal. He once wrote to a woman who had sent him a letter about her own doubts that he believed everything she believed, felt all the doubts she felt, and had arrived at his faith not around the darkness, but through it. Doubt at the edge is not the position of the person about to fall. It is sometimes the position of the person who has finally stopped, pretending they are standing on firmer ground than they actually are. The person who cannot, in good conscience, claim more certainty than they honestly possess. And there is something quietly brave about that. Think of the things you hold with less certainty than you once did. The convictions that arrived with such force in your 20s or 30s, and that now, after everything that has happened in between, feel more complicated. Not wrong, necessarily, but tested, shaped by events that did not fit the theory, refined by the encounter with a reality that turned out to be wider and stranger than the map suggested. This is not failure. This is what a mind looks like when it has actually lived inside its own experience, rather simply maintaining a position against the evidence. Dostoevsky admired this quality of honesty above almost everything else. He despised the person who had arranged their beliefs to be invulnerable to experience, who had built a system so sealed that nothing could disturb it, not other people's pain, not their own private darkness, not the specific, irreducible facts that refused to behave as the system required. He trusted far more the person who had been shaken, who had sat with the question long enough for the question to shake them, and who continued from that shaken place to move forward. The view from the edge of genuine uncertainty is different from the view from the comfortable center of a settled position. You can see further. The ground is less stable. The questions are more alive. But there is something else too, a particular aliveness that comes from not pretending, a contact with what is actually true about your understanding rather than what you are supposed to say. And in Dostoevsky's world, contact with what is real, even when what is real is uncertainty, even when what is real is grief or confusion or the knowledge that some questions have no answers that fit neatly inside language, is always preferable to the comfortable distance of a performed position. The edge is not comfortable, but from the edge you can see the whole landscape, and you can see it honestly, which is, in the end, the only way worth seeing. Chapter 24. Beauty Against Despair. Prince Mishkin, in The Idiot, says something that has become one of the most quoted and debated lines in all of Russian literature. He says, "Beauty will save the world." It is not immediately clear what he means. He is speaking in a room full of people who think he is simple. He is speaking from a state of mind that others in the novel alternately regard as divine insight and as the early signs of an epileptic episode. Dostoevsky did not explain the line. He left it in the novel, charged and open. But his letters, his essays, his notebooks, and the shape of his entire career offer something close to an answer. The beauty he was pointing at was not aesthetic pleasure in the simple sense, not the enjoyment of looking at something pleasing. He was pointing at something more fundamental, the experience of contact with something that is real and true and outside yourself. Let the next breath be slow. Let the body settle further. He had experienced this in the seconds before an epileptic seizure. The extraordinary clarity and intensity that sometimes preceded the fall, a moment when the world seemed to light up with an aliveness that was almost unbearable, almost too much to contain. He had experienced it standing in a square facing rifles. He had experienced it in small and unremarkable moments in the prison camp. The sight of a bird, a shaft of light on a stone wall, another human being's face in a moment of genuine emotion. The experience was not reserved for the spiritual or the aesthetically sophisticated. It was available to anyone willing to pay full attention. And, against despair, Ivan's despair of returning the ticket, the gambler's despair of having lost everything once more, the underground man's despair of being unable to connect with anything real, beauty was not a solution. But it was a reminder that the world being unjust, being painful, being impossible to fully explain or accept, does not preclude the experience of finding it beautiful. Both things can be true at the same time. The grief and the light coming through the window at that particular angle, at that particular moment, can coexist. The question that has no satisfying answer and the face of the person you love, here, in front of you, can coexist. The suffering that cannot be justified and the sound of someone laughing unexpectedly in the next room can coexist. And this is what saves the world. Not the resolution of suffering, not the philosophical defeat of despair, but the continued, stubborn, unjustifiable experience of finding it beautiful anyway, of remaining open to beauty even after every good reason to close. Dostoevsky found it beautiful even at the roulette table, even in the prison camp. Even in the final year, when he was dying of emphysema and racing to finish the last chapters of the Brothers Karamazov before his lungs gave out, he found it beautiful and he kept writing it down, because the writing was his way of saying, "Look, here, this is what is present. Do not miss it. It is easy to miss. It is always easy to miss." The mind that is working on a problem, running a loop, building a case against itself or the world, is not looking at what is actually here, and what is actually here in any given moment is more than the mind's current project. The air, the quiet, the weight of your own body, alive, breathing here. That is not nothing. That is, in Dostoevsky's understanding, the entire thing. Beauty will save the world not as a philosophical argument, but as a practice. The practice of remaining present enough to notice what is real, and choosing again and again to be stopped by it. You know this practice already, even if you have not named it. Think of a day that was genuinely hard. The kind of day where by evening everything felt slightly depleted, the patience, the optimism, the sense that what you are doing is connected to anything larger than the immediate problem in front of you. And then something small happened. Not a solution, not a breakthrough. Something much smaller than that. The particular way light fell across a familiar room at the end of the day. A piece of music that arrived at precisely the right moment, not because you chose it thoughtfully, but because you happened to hear it. The unexpected warmth of someone's voice on the phone. A tree you pass every day that you actually stopped to look at. And something in you, despite the exhaustion, despite the depletion, responded. Not with the emotional equivalent of fireworks. With something quieter, a small, involuntary opening. A moment in which the weight you had been carrying shifted slightly, not because anything had changed, but because something real had reached you. That is what Dostoevsky meant by beauty. Not the formal aesthetic experience of standing in front of great art, though that is part of it. The involuntary opening of the self toward what is actually present. The moment when the mind, despite everything it was working on, was stopped by what was here. He found this in the prison camp. He found it at the roulette table. He found it in the early spring light on Siberian snow, and in the way a particular chord in Russian music could make a man who had no particular reason to feel grateful, feel briefly and completely grateful. It is not a reward for good behavior. It is not reserved for the spiritually advanced. It is available to anyone who is present enough to be stopped. That is, in Dostoevsky's understanding, the entire thing. Beauty will save the world not as a philosophical argument, but as a practice. The practice of remaining present enough to notice what is real, and choosing again and again to be stopped by it. Chapter 25. Why Pain Seeks Meaning. We are close to the question we have been circling since the beginning. Two kinds of suffering. One breaks you down. One breaks you open. What is the difference between them? Viktor Frankl, who built his entire psychology on the question of meaning, found in the concentration camps that what determined whether a person survived, not physically, which was often beyond any individual's control, but psychologically and spiritually, was whether they could find a way to give their suffering a place in a larger story. Not to justify it, not to make it fair or secretly necessary, not to pretend it was secretly good, but to give it a relationship to something that extended beyond the suffering itself. Let your breath settle. Let the body be completely held by what is beneath it. Dostoevsky had found something parallel in a different crucible decades earlier. He wrote later in his life that the Siberian years had been the most important of his existence, not because they were survivable, because they had forced him to see. The young writer, the social persona, the idealistic political thinker, all of it had been stripped away, and what remained had turned out to be more durable than any of the rest. A person who could feel, who could see another person clearly, who understood from inside the experience of being reduced what it meant to be treated as fully human. That knowledge became his life's work. The suffering became the ground on which everything else was built. And here is the difference between the two kinds. The suffering that breaks you down is the suffering you cannot give a place. The suffering that arrives and is pushed away, suppressed, numbed, performed around. The suffering that is not allowed to be what it actually is. It does not disappear. It is stored in the body, in the patterns of reaction, in the ways you move through the world a little more defended than you were before, without quite knowing why. The suffering that breaks you open is the suffering you turn toward, the suffering you sit with long enough to name, to feel in its full weight, to place inside the larger story of who you are and who you are in the process of becoming. It is not that this kind is easier, it is often harder. It requires the willingness to feel what has been avoided, to let the weight of it land rather than deflecting it at the last moment. But when it is fully felt, something changes. The pressure of the unspoken lifts. It becomes part of your story rather than a foreign object embedded in it. And from that integrated place, something becomes available that was not available before. The ability to be present to another person's pain without needing to leave the room, because you have been inside your own. The ability to hold someone who is suffering without needing to fix it or minimize it, because you have learned that bearing the weight of something real is possible, that it does not destroy you, that on the other side of sitting with the hard thing is not nothing, is often, quietly, something. Dostoevsky called this being broken open to love, not romantic love, not the love that depends on the other person's worthiness or readiness, the love that is an orientation of the self toward reality, open to what is real, including what is painful, including what cannot be fixed or explained or made clean. Think of something you have been carrying that has not yet found its place in your story, not the difficulty you have already integrated, the one you can speak about clearly, the one that has a shape and a lesson and a sense of what it eventually gave you, something earlier in that process, something that is still sitting in the body as pressure rather than in the mind as understanding. You do not need to resolve it tonight. But you might consider, gently, which kind of suffering it is currently being. Is it being held at arm's length, managed, minimized, mentioned briefly, and then moved past, allowed to appear in certain rooms of your interior and locked out of others? Or has it been given some room to be what it actually is? There is no judgment in the question. Most of us have things in both categories: the experienced losses that have been thoroughly felt, and the quieter ones that have never quite been given permission to arrive. Dostoevsky's insight is not a prescription for suffering more. It is something more careful than that. It is the observation that the suffering we carry most heavily is often the suffering we have never fully allowed ourselves to feel. That the weight is not in the original event, but in the accumulated energy of keeping the original event at a distance, and that when a person finally turns toward it, slowly, with support, in whatever way is available to them, something changes that cannot be achieved any other way. Not resolution, not the end of the difficulty, the beginning of its becoming part of who you are, rather than a foreign pressure working against who you are trying to be. Raskolnikov, at the very end of the novel, is sitting by a river in Siberia in the early spring, watching the ice breaking apart. And something in him breaks apart with it, not into pieces, into openness. This is what the pain that was seeking meaning eventually finds, not the answer, the opening, the door that was always there, waiting for the self to stop bracing against it long enough to push through. Chapter 26. Love after ruin. Dostoevsky married twice. His first wife, Maria, was a widow he met in Siberia after his release from the prison camp. He pursued her with passionate intensity. The marriage was difficult from the beginning. She was ill with tuberculosis, and the illness made her increasingly hostile. He was in the grip of his gambling addiction and the constant pressure of his writing career. She died in 1864. He was genuinely devastated. Even though the marriage had been miserable, even though they had been, by the end, essentially living apart. He was devastated because he had loved her. Not successfully, not wisely, not in a way that made either of them happy, but genuinely, with the same intensity he brought to everything. Let the air be still. Let your body settle deeper into wherever it is resting. His second marriage was different. Anna Snitkina was 25 years younger than him. She came to his apartment as a stenographer in 1866, hired to help him meet an impossible publisher's deadline. He was 44, debt-ridden, exhausted, still in grief, racing to write The Gambler in 10 days to avoid a contract that would have stripped him of the rights to his future work. She came with her notebook. She stayed for the rest of his life. What Anna gave him was not passion in the dramatic Dostoevskian sense. It was something he had never had before: steadiness. She managed his finances. She handled his publishers. She traveled with him through Europe while he lost money at the gambling tables, and she quietly kept enough back for the train fare home. She bore his children, ran the household, and published his collected works after he died, ensuring that the world did not lose what he had made. And what he gave her was more complicated: the full turbulence of himself, the genius and the compulsion and the debt and the illness and the grief. A life that was, by conventional standards, frequently impossible. She chose it anyway, fully, without reservation. And Dostoevsky, who had spent his career writing about love's capacity to survive damage, to arrive after ruin, to be possible not despite difficulty, but in some way through it, finally, in his own life, experienced what he had been writing about. Love after ruin is not the love that existed before the ruin and survived it. it is a different love, built on the knowledge of what has already been lost and found and lost. Again, built on the experience of one's own worst self and another person's willingness to know it and remain. It has looked at what it is loving clearly, without the softening of new love or the comfort of performance, and decided, yes, even so. And even so is not resignation. Even so is the highest form of choice available, because it is made with full information. Anna knew what she was choosing. She had watched him at the gambling tables. She had received the frantic letters from Baden-Baden and Wiesbaden, the desperate telegrams asking for money, the promises made with complete sincerity and broken with complete helplessness. She did not pretend this was something other than what it was, and she stayed not from weakness or from the absence of better options. She was intelligent, capable, and entirely clear-eyed about the man she had married. She stayed because she had looked at the full picture, the genius alongside the compulsion, the tenderness alongside the chaos, and made a decision that was not innocent of the cost. She was, in Dostoevsky's life, the embodiment of the thing he spent his career writing toward, the person who sees clearly and loves anyway. There is something this kind of love gives that no other form can. It gives the person who receives it the experience of being known, not the performance of themselves, not the best version, carefully maintained. The actual person, difficult, contradictory, still partly unresolved, held steadily by someone who has not looked away. Dostoevsky's characters keep trying to arrive at this. Raskolnikov and Sonia in the final pages, at the very beginning of something that has cost everything. Alyosha, who extends this quality of love to everyone he encounters. Ivan, who cannot yet love this way, but who is honest enough about his inability that there is hope. Think of the people in your own life who have loved you, not despite knowing you, but through knowing you, who have been present for the version of you that was struggling, not the cleaned-up account you tell afterward, but the real time of it, the confusion and the frustration and the self that was not at its best, and who remained. Love after ruin requires the ruin to be honestly faced, the damage to be named rather than performed around. And then, from that named and acknowledged place, the decision to extend toward another human being anyway, to let them matter, to let what happens to them happen to you, too. This is what Dostoevsky spent his life writing toward, and what his own life eventually found. A love that had survived itself, a love that knew the full cost, and chose anyway. Chapter 27, Silence After Judgment. In the final pages of The Brothers Karamazov, there is a scene that most readers remember without being entirely able to say why. Alyosha is standing outside with a group of boys who have come to the funeral of a young child named Ilyusha. The child has died. The grief is real, and Alyosha, rather than offering formal consolation or a philosophical argument about death and meaning, simply gathers the boys and speaks to them. He speaks about Ilyusha specifically, about things the boy actually did, about the quality of the love that was present in the child's short life. And then he says something that Dostoevsky clearly intended as his own final word on the question of how to live. He says, "Remember this moment. Remember this love, even when you are far from here and life has done its worst to you. Remember that once you stood in this place and knew that goodness existed, that it was present in this child, that it was present in each other, that it was here. That memory will not save you from everything, but it will keep something alive that can be saved. Let the room be completely still. Let the body be completely held. Silence after judgment is different from silence before. Before judgment, silence is holding, tense, waiting for something to be decided. After judgment, silence is arrived at. It carries everything that has been said and everything that no longer needs to be. Raskolnikov, at the end of his novel, is silent in a new way, not the silence of a hidden secret. The silence of the person who has finally said the thing that most needed to be said, and who is now in the open air for the first time in what feels like a very long time. He is sitting by the Irtysh River in Siberia when the shift comes. Dostoevsky describes it in a single, brief paragraph. It is early spring. The ice is breaking. The steppe on the far bank stretches away to the horizon, vast and empty, in a way that is not threatening, but releasing. He is looking out at it, and some arrangement of resistance inside him begins, slowly, to give way. He does not have a revelation. He does not arrive at a philosophy. He simply feels for the first time in years that the space around him extends in all directions and is not pressing against him, that he is in the world rather than trapped inside a point in it. This is the silence that Dostoevsky was pointing toward. Not the silence of the person who has given up, not the silence of defeat or numbness, the silence of arrival, the silence that becomes possible when the long interior argument, the case you have been building, the defense you have been preparing, the story you have been managing has finally been set down. He is not happy. He is not resolved. He is in Siberia still, in the early tentative beginning of understanding what his life now means. But the silence around him has changed. It is no longer pressure. It is space. This is what judgment, not the external verdict of courts, but the internal one. The moment when you finally look honestly at yourself and say, I see what happened. I know what I have been. And I am not going to pretend otherwise anymore. This is what it eventually makes possible. Not peace in the simple sense. Space. The spaciousness of a life that is no longer organized around hiding something. Think of the things you carry that you have not fully acknowledged to yourself. Not the large, dramatic ones necessarily. The smaller ones, the versions of events you have allowed to stand because the accurate version is more complicated, more implicating, more in need of something you are not yet ready to give it. The silence after honest judgment does not require you to punish yourself. It only requires you to stop performing the other version. And in that stopping, something opens. Not all at once, not cleanly, but space appears where pressure was before. It does not arrive cleanly or all at once. It requires the long and often painful passage through everything that preceded it. Through the pride and the longing and the guilt and the shame and the confession and the judgment that could not be escaped. But on the other side of all of that, in Dostoevsky's telling, there is a quality of quiet that is genuinely different from anything that came before. The stillness of a person who has been to the hardest place inside themselves and come back. Not unchanged, not unbroken, but here, breathing, still present. Let your breath be slow. The body knows how to rest when the mind allows it. You do not need to reach the end of any sentence tonight. You do not need to resolve anything before morning. You are already here. And here, in the quiet, after everything that has been said tonight, is enough. Chapter 28, Depth Born of Mercy. Near the end of the Brothers Karamazov, the elder Zosima describes what he considers the most important practice of his life. Not prayer in the formal sense, not study, not discipline in the way a monk might mean it. He describes a daily practice of directing mercy first toward himself, toward his own failures and limitations, the harshness of his own judgments, the moments where he found it easier to be right than to be kind, and discovering that this internal mercy was what made it possible to extend anything real to the people who came to him. You cannot give from emptiness. You cannot extend genuine compassion outward from a place of constant self-condemnation. Depth in Dostoevsky's world is not something you pursue directly. It is something that accumulates when you stop defending yourself from experience, when you let the suffering have its full weight, when you let the love have its full risk, when you let the doubt be genuine and the faith be fragile and the questions be real and unresolved. Let your breath settle. Let the weight of your body be fully accepted by whatever is beneath you. Mercy is the practice that makes depth possible, not the mercy that excuses or ignores what happened. The mercy that sees clearly, acknowledges fully, and continues to open rather than close. So, here is a 7-day path. Not a demand, not a prescription, an invitation. Something to carry gently into the days ahead. Day 1. Begin with what is heaviest. Today, notice one thing you have been carrying that you have not named. Not the largest thing you carry, just one thing. Give it a name. even a simple approximate name, the regret about that year, the anger that has not been allowed its full expression, the grief that has no ceremony attached to it. Just name it. That is enough for today. Day 2, let one judgment soften. Choose one person you have judged harshly, including, if necessary, yourself. Not to excuse what happened, but to sit for a moment with the question of what they might have been carrying, what they had survived or not survived, what was happening in their interior that was not visible. You do not need to arrive at forgiveness. Just curiosity about the fuller picture. Day 3, notice what you avoid. At some point today, notice the thing you consistently move away from, the thought you redirect before it fully forms, the feeling you manage before it can fully arrive. You do not have to let it in completely. Just notice the avoidance. Just see the door you consistently walk past. That noticing is already a kind of honesty. Day 4, speak one honest thing. Today, say one thing that is true, but that you usually keep back to yourself, to someone else, to the page. It does not need to be profound or large, just honest. Practice the sound of truth in your own voice. Notice how different it feels from the version you usually offer. Day 5, extend mercy toward yourself. Find one thing you have been holding against yourself. One failure, one shortcoming, 1 year that did not go the way it needed to, and offer it the same quality of understanding you would offer a person you love who had been through something similar. Not because you have earned the gentleness, because it may be time. Day 6. Be present to one person. Today, give someone your full attention for a few minutes. Not while also thinking about something else, just them. Just this conversation, this face, this presence. Let them be real to you in the way that Dostoevsky's characters were real to him, fully, without reservation, with the whole weight of your attention. Day 7, sit with beauty. Tonight, before you sleep, let yourself be stopped by something beautiful. The quality of the dark in the room, the sound of the house settling, the weight of the blanket, the simple, unremarkable fact of being here, breathing, alive, in a body that has carried you this far through an existence that was not always easy. Let that be enough. Let it be more than enough. Let it be. For a single breath, everything. Chapter 29. The soul learns tenderness. By the end of his life, Dostoevsky had stopped trying to explain suffering. He had spent decades examining it, writing about it, inhabiting it through his characters and through his own experience. He had stood inside every angle of the question, the anger of Ivan, the surrender of Alyosha, the exhausted confession of Raskolnikov, the desperate, unjustifiable beauty-seeking of Mishkin. And what he arrived at, finally, in the last year of his life, was something quieter than any of those positions. He arrived at tenderness, not as a philosophy, not as a conclusion, as a practice, a way of moving through the world with the awareness that everyone you encounter is carrying something you cannot see, that the impatient person at the counter is probably not simply impatient, that the silence in a relationship is probably not simply distance, that the harshness a person shows is very often the inverse of what they actually feel and cannot say. Let us pause here for a moment, not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to notice. Your body has been with you through this entire conversation. It has been breathing, settling, resting in whatever position you found. It has been doing its work without your management, without your direction. Let your attention move to wherever your body feels heaviest right now. Maybe your legs, maybe the back of your neck, maybe the area around your eyes. Just notice. There is nothing to change. Now, think of someone in your life who is suffering in a way you have not fully allowed yourself to see. Not because you do not care, but because keeping the awareness at a slight distance is sometimes easier, because letting it fully land changes what is required of you. Let it land for a moment, not to fix it, not to solve it, just to feel the weight of it, the way Dostoevsky felt the weight of his characters, with full seriousness, with nothing held back. Now bring that same quality of attention toward yourself. Think of whatever you have been carrying that has not yet been fully acknowledged. The tiredness that is not only physical, the question that keeps returning because it has not yet been answered in a way that satisfies. The thing you did or did not do, that you have been circling quietly for longer than you would like to admit. And now, without trying to fix any of it, without running it through the analysis one more time, without deciding what it means or what it should require of you, just see it. The way the elder Zosima saw the people who came to him with full attention. Without a verdict, you are carrying what you are carrying. You arrived here through a specific set of experiences that no one else had in exactly your configuration, in exactly your order. You have done what you could within the limits of what you knew and what you had available to you and who you were in the moments that turned out to matter. And you are still here, still breathing, still present enough to sit with these questions in the dark at this hour. That is not a small thing. Dostoevsky believed that the soul, no matter how far it travels into difficulty, retains its capacity for tenderness. He had seen it in the roughest prisoners. He had found it in himself in the darkest periods of his own life. He had written it into being in character after character, even the most broken. The tenderness was always there, waiting for the performance to exhaust itself, waiting for the armor to be set down, even briefly, waiting for the recognition that you are, at the most fundamental level, a person who is trying, who has always been trying, with whatever was available. That recognition is tenderness. And tonight, if you can hold it for even one breath, for even the duration of one slow exhale, that is already the beginning of something. Let your breath be slow. Let the quiet be complete. You do not need to carry into tomorrow everything you have been carrying today. Chapter 30. A quiet descent within. We began tonight with a wound. Not your wound specifically, the wound that Dostoevsky's life and work keeps returning to. The wound that is, in some sense, the condition of being awake enough to suffer, to question, to love, to lose. We sat with the underground man who could not stop watching himself from outside, who was most articulate about the trap he could not escape. We sat with Raskolnikov, who thought his way into a corner he could not think his way out of, and who eventually found that the only exit was through honesty. We sat with Mishkin, who opened without armor and paid the full price for it, and who was, for all that, more alive than the defended people around him. We sat with Ivan, who refused to accept an accounting that would not account for innocent suffering, who was honest about his rebellion in a way that Dostoevsky could not dismiss. We sat with Alyosha, who held all of this, every difficulty, every darkness, every person who came to him in pieces and remained open. And we sat with Dostoevsky himself. Let your breath be final and easy. Let your eyes be closed or your gaze be soft. The young man who stood in a cold square before a row of rifles and discovered, in the seconds that felt like a much longer time, what he actually wanted. Not escape, more of the ordinary minutes, more of the difficult conversations and the impossible love and the questions without answers and the beauty that arrived without permission in the middle of the worst circumstances. He wanted the whole thing. He got 40. More years of it. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without decades of debt and illness and the particular torment of a mind that could not rest. But 40 years. Anna. Children. The books that came out of everything he had survived. And then, at 60, in January of 1881, he died. A blood vessel had burst in his lung. He had been working on the chapters he would not finish. He called his children to him. He asked Anna to read from the New Testament. The passage she read was the parable of the prodigal son, the story of the person who goes away, loses everything, and returns to find, against all reasonable expectation, that the door is still open, that they are still welcome, that the return is not met with judgment, but with something the judgment-expecting person cannot quite take in. He died that night. What he left behind is extraordinary, in a way that is very simple to state. He left behind the knowledge that the interior life matters, that what happens inside a person, the guilt and the longing and the shame and the rebellion and the faith that comes after doubt and the love that comes after ruin, is not peripheral to the important events of a human life. It is the important event. It is, in fact, the only event worth the full weight of attention. The descent within that Dostoevsky kept urging his readers toward is not a retreat from the world. It is, in his understanding, the most consequential journey available. Because what you find there, the specific contents of your own interior, the things you have been carrying, the questions you have not yet answered, the tenderness that is still present beneath the armor, is the raw material of every relationship you will ever have. Every word you will say to someone you love, every moment of patience you will manage or fail to manage. Every small and private kindness that no one will witness, but that will, nevertheless, change something in the person who receives it. The quiet descent within is where all of that begins. Dostoevsky went there again and again with his difficult and brilliant and suffering mind, and he came back each time with his hands full of characters who were real, full of questions that were alive, full of the stubborn, unjustifiable insistence that beauty exists, that love is possible after ruin, that the wound that goes deep enough eventually opens rather than only closes. Let the room be completely quiet now. Let the weight of your body be all the way down. You have traveled a long way tonight, through a particular kind of darkness with a particular kind of guide. You do not need to have arrived anywhere. You are here, in the quiet, with whatever this evening has left you, and in the morning. If something has shifted, even slightly, even in a way that cannot yet be named, that will be enough. That has always been enough. Rest now.